Chapter 2154. Shao Chun was still able to gain the upper hand, even though there was a gap of a whole realm between them. Although Shao Chun had not caused any substantial harm to the elder of the heavenly sect, and it was still too early to say who would win or lose, the combat strength that Shao Chun had displayed was enough to shock everyone present. Shao Chun was still able to gain the upper hand, even though there was a gap of a whole realm between them. Although Shao Chun had not caused any substantial harm to the elder of the heavenly sect, and it was still too early to say who would win or lose, the combat strength that Shao Chun had displayed was enough to shock everyone present. If there were some people who had doubts about the younger generation like Shao Chun and felt that it was too early for them to control an era, then now, after personally witnessing the top combat strength of the younger generation, there was no need for such doubts. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that since Shao Chun was able to fight with this Hetien sect elder, then the other geniuses definitely had combat strength comparable to an end realm expert. At such a young age, with such cultivation, they were able to fight against an end realm expert. Looking at it this way, the younger generation had indeed completely matured. Shao Chun's combat strength exceeded everyone's expectations. Seeing that the elder was forced back by Shao Chun, the other four elders of the Hetien sect immediately made a decision and gave the order to retreat. Now wasn't the time to fight with the sword sect. Moreover, if they continued to fight, the result would be hard to say. Therefore, the Hetien sect chose to retreat. Hearing that the other four gave the order to retreat, the elder who was fighting with Shao Chun looked at Shao Chun unhappily. However, he didn't say anything and obediently turned around and left quickly. This elder didn't have the intention to continue fighting with Shao Chun. As for his departure, Shao Chun didn't force him to stay. This was because this elder knew that it wouldn't be easy to take down Shao Chun, so he didn't continue fighting. Shao Chun also knew that although he had the upper hand, he was far from being able to suppress his opponent. Therefore, even if he forced him to stay, he wouldn't be able to stop him if he insisted on leaving. However, although it was a draw, after the battle with this Hetien sect elder, Shao Chun had a clearer understanding of his own combat strength. Facing an ordinary or low-level end realm expert, with his current strength, he could indeed compete with them. He didn't dare to say that he would win, but protecting himself wouldn't be too much a problem. Such an outcome was already very good for Shao Chun. As the people of Hetien sect quickly retreated, the battle quickly came to an end. Under the attacks of the experts of the sword sect, Hetien sect finally retreated. As the experts of Hetien sect quickly retreated, the people of Spirit Crane sect came in front of Shao Chun and the others. The three old ancestors of Spirit Crane sect, as well as Chi Mu, took the lead and bowed respectfully to Shao Chun. "Thank you, sect leader, for saving us. The entire Spirit Crane sect will never forget this." "There's no need for that. Spirit Crane sect is a subsidiary sect of the Sword sect. The Sword sect naturally wouldn't sit by and do nothing." Hearing this, Shao Chun didn't mind and smiled lightly. Facing Shao Chun, the three old ancestors of Spirit Crane sect were relatively calm. After all, no matter what, the three of them were end realm experts and had seen a lot. They should be respectful, but they wouldn't be too deliberate or nervous. On the contrary, Chi Mu, who was standing beside the three of them, was unusually excited when facing Shao Chun. His eyes were filled with incomparable admiration. As he continued to interact with Shao Chun, Chi Mu didn't notice that his admiration for Shao Chun was getting stronger and stronger. The current Chi Mu probably wouldn't even frown if Shao Chun asked him to die. This was because in Chi Mu's eyes, Shao Chun was his idol and his life goal. He also noticed that Chi Mu was looking at him with fanatical admiration. However, Shao Chun didn't say much about it. After exchanging some pleasantries, Shao Chun was led by the people of Spirit Crane sect to the main hall of Spirit Crane sect. Due to the previous battle, many places in Spirit Crane sect were damaged. Fortunately, the main hall didn't suffer much damage because of the protection of the talisman array. At this moment, in the main hall, Shao Chun, Nan Gongguan, Li Ku, Lin Qing, Yang Song, Chi Mu, and the three old ancestors of Spirit Crane sect were gathered together. As for the others, they had all gone to recuperate. Sitting on the main seat, Chi Mu and the 3 old ancestors of Spirit Crane sect were below Shao Chen's right-hand side. Nangong Guan and the other 3 old ancestors were below Shao Chen's left-hand side. Looking directly at Chi Mu, Shao Chun didn't beat around the bush and directly said, "Chi Mu, I'm thinking of extending the power of the Sword Sect to Spirit Crane sect. This way, we could take care of each other and support each other more conveniently." The meaning of Shao Chen's words was obvious. He wanted to expand the area of the Sword Mansion. After all, although the Sword Sect had announced to the public that it was independent and established the Sword Mansion, the area of the Sword Mansion was still too small compared to the entire Heitian Prefecture. After all, the Sword Mansion was just the land of the Jian Province. Its area was only a fraction of the size of the Heitian Prefecture. Therefore, Shao Chun wanted to expand the area of the Sword Mansion. Since the Spirit Crane sect had joined the Sword Sect, it wasn't impossible for the Sword Sect to extend their power here and make this place a part of the Sword Mansion. Of course, this would require the full support of the Spirit Crane sect. Upon hearing Shao Chen's words, with Chi Mu's admiration for Shao Chun, it was naturally impossible for him to refuse. Without any hesitation, Chi Mu nodded and said, "Since it's an order from the sect leader, we'll naturally obey it. Everyone in the Spirit Crane sect will be at your disposal at any time." Chi Mu supported Shao Chun unconditionally. Upon hearing this, Shao Chun smiled faintly. This Chi Mu was indeed interesting. However, with his loyalty to the Sword Sect and himself, there was no need to worry too much about this person. If he wanted to extend the area of the Sword Mansion's influence and become an equal to the Heitian Prefecture, there was still a process to be done. Moreover, this was only the beginning. Shao Chen's ultimate goal was to completely control the Heitian Prefecture and turn it into the Sword Sect. Then, he would annihilate the Heitian sect and replace it with the Sword Sect. The Sword Sect would truly stand among the 10 great Ling Tian sects and obtain Tenzu's approval. This was the path that Shao Chun was going to take. There would definitely be many difficulties during this period. As soon as Chi Mu's words left his mouth, his master stood up and bowed to Shao Chun as he said calmly, "Sect leader, I'm afraid I have to say something." "Sect leader, there's something that I don't want to say." "Oh, there's no harm in speaking," Shao Chun said with a smile as he looked at Chi Mu's master, indicating that he did not need to worry. "Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of this chapter. Chapter 2155. In the Sword Sect, Song Xing and the others knew of Shao Chen's character. Shao Chun was usually very easygoing. Moreover, when they were discussing matters, everyone would speak freely. Shao Chun wouldn't punish someone just because they said something wrong. After receiving Shao Chen's approval, Chi Mu's master cupped his hands and bowed. Then he spoke unhurriedly. "Shang Sect Master, there's nothing wrong with wanting to expand the Sword Mansion's territory. However, I wonder how Shang Sect Master plans to deal with the large and small forces that chose to join the Heavenly Sect." Shao Chun wanted to expand the Sword Mansion's territory. It wasn't limited to the Jian province. However, there was a problem. How should he deal with the forces that chose to join the Heavenly Sect? One had to know that other than the Jian province, the Spirit Crane sect wasn't the only force that chose to join the Sword Sect. At the same time, there were many forces that chose to join the Heavenly Sect. If the Sword Sect wanted to expand its territory, it was necessary to think of a way to deal with these sections. This was also a crucial problem. After hearing Chi Mu's master's words, Shao Chun nodded in agreement. Then he asked softly, "Then in your opinion, what should I do?" "No matter how you deal with them, Shang Sect Master mustn't be as ruthless as the Heavenly Sect," said Chi Mu's master indifferently. "He mustn't be like the Heavenly Sect, because if he did, the Sword Sect would also lose the support of the people and waste the great situation that they had now." After hearing Chi Mu's master's words, Shao Chun laughed heartily. "Haha, that's right. Lin Qing, take out the map." In fact, Shao Chun had already prepared for this. He had even drawn a map of the Sword Mansion beforehand. Of course, the area marked on the map was only Shao Chun's ideal. As for how far the Sword Mansion could develop, it was still unknown. After all, the heavenly sect would not watch the Sword Mansion expand without doing anything. Hearing Xiao Qin's words, Lin Qing took out the map that he had prepared in advance. On the map, the entire Hetian prefecture was marked. At the same time, the area of Sword Mansion was marked in red, which was about half of the total area of Hetian prefecture. The division of the Sword Mansion on the map was Xiao Qin's ideal Sword Mansion. Seeing the map, Qi Mu's master and the other two elders of the Spirit Crane sect were stunned. The three of them did not expect that Xiao Qin had already prepared everything. Moreover, according to the map, Xiao Qin's idea was actually very perfect. It did not push the heavenly sect to the limit, but it also maximized the benefits for the sword sect. Dividing the entire Hetian prefecture into two, with the sword sect and the heavenly sect occupying half each, the heavenly sect would be extremely unhappy. However, based on the current situation, there was an 80% chance that Yangchen would suppress his anger. After carefully observing for a while, Qi Mu's master finally took the lead and said, "Sect Master's idea is almost perfect. This old man admires it." Xiao Qin's idea could indeed be said to be very perfect. There was almost no need to change anything. After hearing this, Xiao Qin did not feel proud at all. This was because this map was discussed by Xiao Qin, Song Xing, and the other deputy sect masters. From the beginning, everyone had been planning it. After many modifications and deliberations, naturally, there would not be too many loopholes. In the face of Qi Mu's master's praise, Xiao Qin said calmly, "If we want to achieve everything on this map, we still need everyone's joint efforts. As for those forces that have chosen the heavenly sect, ask them to withdraw from the Sword Mansion immediately." Unlike the heavenly sect, Xiao Qin did not choose to exterminate them. Instead, he chose to expel all the forces that had chosen the heavenly sect to the Hetian prefecture. Of course, if someone insisted on not listening, Xiao Qin would not be merciful. He would directly exterminate them. After all, he had given them a chance. With a way to deal with it, Qi Mu and his master did not have the slightest objection to Xiao Qin's order. They had successfully rescued the Spirit Crane sect. At the same time, the other large sects and clans that had chosen to rely on the sword sect were also protected by Song Xing and the others. They managed to survive the heavenly sect's encirclement without any mishap. With the sword sect's all-out attack, the heavenly sect had indeed exterminated a few small forces that had chosen to rely on the sword sect. However, the final result was very different from Yangchen's plan. In the beginning, Yangchen had decided to kill those forces that had chosen to rely on the sword sect. His purpose was to intimidate and establish his prestige. However, the effect had not been achieved. Not only did it not have much of a deterrent effect, but it also did not establish any prestige. At the same time, because of Yangchen's actions, many forces harbored hatred towards the heavenly sect. As a result, they leaned even more towards the sword sect's camp. In addition, compared to the heavenly sect, the sword sect's actions had won the hearts of many. In comparison, Yangchen's action could be said to be a complete failure. Now, because of a series of actions of the heavenly sect, the large and small forces that had joined the sword sect's camp could be said to be united against a common enemy. Their trust in the sword sect had reached an unprecedented height. In the next few days, the experts of the heavenly sect chose to withdraw. Because of the sword sect's actions, although both sides had a great battle, they still restrained themselves. Therefore, the heavenly sect did not forcibly fight the sword sect to the death. After a fierce battle, they chose to withdraw. The more important sects and clans in the sword sect's camp were successfully rescued by the sword sect. At the same time, Xiao Qin announced the map of the Sword Mansion's territory to the public. Unlike when he first announced the establishment of the Sword Mansion, this time, Xiao Qin directly took out the map of the Sword Mansion's territory and announced it to the public. On the map, the Sword Mansion's area was almost the same as the Heavenly Sect's area. The original Heavenly Sect was completely divided into two on Xiao Qin's map. Along with the announcement of the map, Many experts of the Sword Sect guarded the border between the Sword Mansion and the Heavenly Sect to prevent the Heavenly Sect's invasion. At the same time, they began to expel the forces that had chosen to rely on the Heavenly Sect. They did not directly kill them. Instead, they were given 3 days to withdraw from the Sword Mansion. If they withdrew within 3 days, Shao Chun would not take action against them. The Sword Sect's actions caused an uproar in the Heavenly Sect. Naturally, Yang Chun, who was in the Heavenly Sect, also knew about this news. At this moment, in the Heavenly Sect, Yang Chun was holding the Sword Sect's map in his hand. His face was extremely gloomy, begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2156. In the Heavenly Sect, Yang Chun held a map of the Sword Mansion distributed by the Sword Sect in his hand. The map clearly indicated the size of the Sword Mansion, which took up almost half of the entire Heavenly Sect. In other words, the Heavenly Sect had been forcefully divided in half by Shao Chun. How could Yang Chun not be furious? He clenched his teeth so hard that they almost shattered. The anger in his eyes was almost spurting out. From the failure of the mission to the current map of the Sword Mansion, Yang Chun's anger continued to grow. Damn it! The 10 mansions were jointly divided by the 10 Great Ling Tian sects. Shao Chun, are you trying to offend the whole world? The 10 mansions were indeed jointly divided by the 10 Great Ling Tian sects. However, the other Ling Tian sects obviously did not have the time to care about the Heavenly Sect's matter. For example, the situation in the Heavenly Sect was already so chaotic. However, none of the Great Ling Tian sects stood out to speak up for the Heavenly Sect. Firstly, it was because the 10 mansions had just been formed. The other Ling Tian sects had many things to deal with. They could not even manage their own affairs, let alone other people's troubles. Secondly, the other Ling Tian sects did not want to participate in the battle between the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Sect. They did not care who the Heavenly Sect would belong to in the end. After all, it was the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Sect's matter. Therefore, Shao Chun's public establishment of the Sword Mansion and forceful division of the Heavenly Sect into two did not affect the other Ling Tian sects at all. After all, it did not affect other people's interests. Therefore, naturally, no one was willing to meddle in other people's business. Moreover, the Sword Sect's current strength was not so easy to deal with. Yang Chun was very clear about this. He knew that he could only rely on himself for the Heavenly Sect's matter. He could not rely on the others at all. Even Yun Tianyi from the Mu Tian Mountain was unreliable. This was because Yun Tianyi was currently busy dealing with his own sex matters. It was impossible for him to care about the Heavenly Sect's matters here. Tearing the map in his hand into pieces, Yang Chun suppressed the anger in his heart and glared at the elders in front of him. Facing the furious Yang Chun, the elders of Heavenly Gate lowered their heads and remained silent. However, to everyone's surprise, just when everyone thought that Yang Chun would fly into a rage, Yang Chun suddenly laughed. It was as if the anger in his heart had dissipated in an instant. However, only Yang Chun himself knew that he was laughing out of extreme anger. With Yang Chun's personality, how could the anger in his heart disappear so quickly after suffering defeat at the hands of Shao Chun? Yang Chun was so angry that he laughed, or rather, it was an expression of helplessness in his heart. Based on the current situation, it was true that the Heavenly Gate could no longer suppress the Sword Sect unless an all-out war was declared. However, there were some things that Yang Chun was still preparing for the final battle with the Sword Sect. Now is not the time. Previously, his master, Tao Ming, had attacked the Sword Sect twice, but both times had ended in failure. Learning from the previous lesson, Yang Chun knew that if he wanted to destroy the Sword Sect, he had to be well prepared. Otherwise, it was very likely that he would repeat the same mistake. If the Heavenly Gate was defeated by the Sword Sect 3 times, it would definitely be a fatal blow to the Heavenly Gate. It was precisely because of this that Yang Chun had to endure it again and again. In fact, Shao Chun had grasped Yang Chun's mentality very well. He knew that Yang Chun would not start an all-out war with the Sword Sect at this time. Therefore, Shao Chun dared to expand the Sword Mansion's sphere of influence so unscrupulously. Of course, Shao Chun's division of the Sword Mansion's area was actually done after a lot of consideration. Although it seemed unacceptable to Yang Chun, it did not touch Yang Chun's bottom line. To put it bluntly, Yang Chun could accept Shao Chun's way of doing things. He could endure it. If Shao Chun directly expanded the Sword Mansion's area by one province, Yang Chun would probably not be able to tolerate it anymore. This was because the Sword Mansion's area would exceed the Heavenly Gates. However, although Shao Chun's Sword Mansion's area had been expanded by a lot, it was still one province less than the Heavenly Gates area. As a result, it did not really touch Yang Chun's bottom line. Yang Chun roared with laughter. The elders of the Heavenly Gate were rather confused when they heard Yang Chun's laughter. They all raised their heads to look at Yang Chun, who was laughing. Under their gazes, Yang Chun stopped laughing after quite a while and slowly sat down. There was not the slightest trace of anger on his face. Instead, he spoke with a smile. I never thought that there would be a day when I would be infuriated. Haha, how laughable. Simply laughable. Don't you all agree? Yang Chun was actually laughing at himself. Naturally, no one dared to casually answer him. Seeing that they were silent, Yang Chun did not make a fuss about it and continued. Master has once said that the outcome is still unknown until the very end. Now is not the time to destroy the sword sect. There's no harm in letting Shao Chun be complacent for a while. I lost my composure earlier and made quite a few mistakes, but that's fine. It's not certain who will have the last laugh. Yang Chun quickly regained his composure amidst his extreme anger. Moreover, when he recalled the mistakes he had made due to his anger, he could only smile bitterly. It had to be said that Yang Chun was indeed worthy of being called a monstrous genius. He quickly woke up from his mistakes. At this moment, Yang Chun was very clear that even though the Sword Sect seemed to be on par with the Heavenly Gate, and the Heavenly Gate was unable to do anything to the Sword Sect, it was like a castle in the air that could collapse at any time. Even though Shao Chun had divided the Sword Sect, if the Sword Sect was defeated in the final battle, the Sword Sect would naturally cease to exist. Therefore, the outcome of the final battle still had to be determined. In this way, it was not advisable to be tangled up in such trivial matters. It was an irrational decision. Yang Chun suddenly regretted his actions. As such, he completely let go of the matter regarding the Sword Sect. He would first let Shao Chun be happy. As for the final outcome, it would only be determined after the final battle. After laughing, Yang Chun looked at everyone present and said, "Pass down my order. Tell all the major forces in the Sword Sect to return to the Heavenly Gate and send people to protect them." Hearing Yang Chun's words, everyone present was stunned. They did not expect Yang Chun to make such a decision. Immediately, someone asked in confusion, "Sect Master, are we just going to let the matter of the Sword Sect go? A castle in the air has no foundation after all. What's wrong with giving it to him temporarily?" Yang Chun replied with a smile. "Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 2157. Yang Chun, who was infuriated, regained his composure and quickly figured out many things. Yang Chun, who was infuriated, regained his composure and quickly figured out many things. In fact, Yang Chun's current thinking was correct. Instead of fighting with Shao Chun over these useless things, it was better to focus on the final battle between both parties. This was because only that battle would determine everything. The outcome of the final battle would determine everything. Seeing that Yang Chun had regained his composure so quickly, the various elders of the Heavenly Sect heaved a sigh of relief. This was because the current situation was indeed not suitable for them to continue entangling with the Sword Sect. Preparing for the final battle was the most important thing for the Heavenly Sect. However, when they heard that Yang Chun had allowed the Heavenly Sect's experts to enter the Sword Mansion to provide protection for the forces that had chosen to join the Heavenly Sect, some of them still voiced their concerns. "Sect leader, will the Sword Sect sit by and watch us enter the Sword Mansion?" With the current relationship between the two sects, the Sword Sect would definitely not sit by and watch the Heavenly Sect's experts enter the Sword Mansion. it was very likely that a conflict would arise. However, Yang Chun was extremely confident in this matter. They won't. Moreover, you all have to enter the Sword Mansion openly. Not only will the Sword Sect not make things difficult for you, they will even open their doors wide for you. Yang Chun was certain that the Sword Sect would not make things difficult for them. This was because Xiao Chun, like Yang Chun, seemed to be coming with a ferocious momentum. In fact, Xiao Chun was also unwilling to start an all-out war with the Heavenly Sect at this time. Moreover, this time, the Heavenly Sect's experts entering the Sword Mansion was actually helping the Sword Sect solve a huge problem. After all, with the Heavenly Sect's appearance, the forces that were still in the Sword Mansion but had already submitted to the Heavenly Sect would obviously be more obedient and move to the Heavenly Sect. This was also something that Xiao Chun hoped to see. Of course, Yang Chun did this to make up for his previous mistakes. After completely calming down, Yang Chun also realized that his previous actions were indeed somewhat unpopular. And this time, sending experts from the Heavenly Sect to pick up those big and small sects was also to win over some people's hearts and make up for what they had done before. To put it bluntly, the experts from the Heavenly Sect going to the Sword Province this time was just going through the motions. There wouldn't be too much of a problem. Yang Chun regained his composure. At the same time, a wave of confidence rose up spontaneously, as if everything was under his control. Upon hearing Yang Chun's words, many of the Heavenly Sect's elders present nodded in agreement. Very quickly, the Heavenly Sect's experts set off one after another. They rushed towards the border between the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Sect. At the same time, they took the initiative to send a message to the Sword Sect, hoping that the Sword Sect would allow them to enter the Sword Mansion and receive the factions that had chosen to join the Heavenly Sect. Spirit Crane Sect. Recently, Xiao Chun had been staying in the Spirit Crane Sect. After all, it was closer to the Heavenly Sect, and the situation there was more chaotic. Thus, Xiao Chun had to personally oversee it. Xiao Chun, who was sitting in his cave abode, also received a message from the Coiling Heaven Sect. He glanced at Nangong Guan, who was sitting beside him, and smiled faintly. It seems like Yang Chun really can't be underestimated. Yang Chun seemed to have acknowledged the Sword Mansion's position and tacitly agreed to split the Heavenly Sect into two, with the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Sect occupying half each. However, Xiao Chun knew very well that Yang Chun had never acknowledged all of this. He was temporarily enduring it in order to prepare for the final battle. If Yang Chun was infuriated by the Sword Mansion's matter and didn't hesitate to declare war on the Sword Sect, then Xiao Chun would probably look down on him, because such a person was nothing to be afraid of. Unfortunately, Yang Chun didn't let Xiao Chun get what he wanted. In fact, Xiao Chun felt that Yang Chun was even more powerful than before. Therefore, Xiao Chun didn't hesitate to praise Yang Chun in front of Nangong Guan. A person who blindly acted tough wasn't scary, and a person who blindly endured wasn't scary either. The most terrifying person was a person who could adapt to circumstances. A person like this knew when to endure and when to take action. When it was time to endure, he could endure all kinds of humiliation. When it was time to take action, he wouldn't hesitate or show any mercy. Therefore, people like this were the most difficult to guard against. Yang Chun seemed to be such a person. When she heard Xiao Chun's words, Nangong Guan's expression didn't change. Then what should we do now? Agree or refuse? Of course we have to agree. It's much better for the Heavenly Sect to step forward than for us. Those large and small powers will also be more obedient, Xiao Chun said without hesitation. Yang Chun had already expected Xiao Chun's answer. Of course, it wasn't strange because Xiao Chun didn't have any other choice. Moreover, Xiao Chun clearly knew that Yang Chun was doing this to win over the hearts of the people and make up for what he had done in the past. However, Xiao Chun couldn't refuse. This was because once he refused to allow the Heavenly Sect's experts to enter the Sword Mansion to receive the large and small powers that had submitted to them, the Sword Mansion would very likely fall into chaos. This was clearly the scene that Xiao Chun didn't want to see the most. What was the most important thing for the newly established Sword Mansion? Stability. What the sword sect needed to do the most was to take control of the entire sword mansion as quickly as possible. This way, Shao Chun and the entire sword sect would have enough energy to prepare for the upcoming final battle. To be honest, Yang Qin's response had indeed exceeded Shao Qin's expectations. He had to admit that Shao Chun had indeed underestimated Yang Chun. When she heard Shao Qin's words, Nangong Guan didn't say anything. She nodded her head and walked out of the courtyard. Just as Yang Chun had expected, the sword sect didn't refuse the heavenly sect's experts' request to enter the sword mansion. Not only did they not obstruct them, they even opened the door for them. As the heavenly sect's experts entered the sword mansion, those large and small powers that had previously submitted to the heavenly sect but remained in the sword mansion also obediently chose to move to the heavenly sect. The heavenly sect's experts didn't make any moves. This was something that Yang Chun had specifically instructed them to do. This time, they didn't need to do anything extra. They only needed to safely move those powers to the heavenly sect. Of course, even if the heavenly sect's experts had any ulterior motives, the sword sect's experts would always be monitoring them. The large and small powers that had submitted to the heavenly sect obediently moved to the heavenly sect. In this regard, Shao Chun, who was in the Spirit Crane sect, was naturally happy to see this. As for the fact that Yang Chun had bought over many people's hearts, this was something that couldn't be helped. After all, not everything would go according to Shao Chun's plan. Accidents were inevitable. All in all, the final outcome was something that Shao Chun could accept. As for Yang Chun, he seemed to have accepted this outcome for the time being. The heavenly sect had been divided into two, with the sword sect and the heavenly sect occupying one side each. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2158. In the territory of the Sword Mansion, the large and small forces who had sided with the heavenly sect retreated one after another. The situation in the Sword Mansion was also quickly stabilized by the Sword Sect. In the territory of the Sword Mansion, the large and small forces who had sided with the heavenly sect retreated one after another. The situation in the Sword Mansion was also quickly stabilized by the Sword Sect. Surprisingly, the powerhouses from the heavenly sect did not do anything unnecessary when they entered the Sword Mansion. There was also no conflict between the two parties, which was rare. Everything seemed to have been rehearsed. After the powerhouses from the heavenly sect received the various forces from their own camp, they actually obediently retreated from the Sword Mansion. In the eyes of outsiders, all of this was indeed very unusual. However, in the eyes of Shao Chun and Yang Chun, all of this was a matter of course. The situation in the Sword Mansion gradually stabilized, and the situation in the entire heavenly sect seemed to have gradually become clearer. Currently, the entire heavenly sect had shrunk by half, and the Sword Mansion had become the 11th mansion in the Great Thousand World. In this regard, the other Ling Tian sects did not have the slightest reaction. It was as though they did not care at all. Everything seemed to be progressing in a good direction. On this day, outside the Spirit Crane sect, Shao Chun, accompanied by Qi Mu, personally came to the mountain gate. It seemed as though they were waiting for someone. Who exactly was it that made Shao Chun personally come? Very soon, the answer was obvious. It was Qin Shi and the other ladies who had brought Shao Wan and the rest to the Spirit Crane sect. Since his wife and daughter were here, Shao Chun naturally had to perform better. Moreover, during this period of time, Shao Chun had indeed neglected them, especially Wan Wan. For this reason, the little girl had complained to Shao Chun more than once. It was also because of this that the ladies had strongly requested Wan Wan to come to the Spirit Crane sect to look for Shao Chun. With the appearance of the few ladies, Shao Wan naturally threw herself into Shao Chen's arms immediately. As for Qi Mu, he was a little stunned when he saw Qin Shi and the other ladies in front of him. Previously, he had heard that Shao Chen's wives were all outstanding beauties. However, now it seemed that it was not an exaggeration at all. Even Xiao Xiao, who was known as one of the two beauties in the Great Thousand World, was only comparable to Qin Shi and the other ladies in terms of appearance. Holding Wan Wan in his arms, Xiao Chun greeted the girls before introducing them to each other. This is Chi Mu, the sect master of the Spirit Crane sect. Chi Mu, this is my wife and daughter. Xiao Chun introduced them to each other. Hearing that, Chi Mu hurriedly bowed respectfully and said, "Greetings, madams." Sect leader Chi, "You're too courteous," Qin Shiru and the other ladies replied politely. Under Chi Mu's lead, Xiao Chun and the rest quickly returned to the Spirit Crane sect. In the cave dwelling, Qin Shiru and the other ladies sat together with Xiao Chun in a circle. Luan Luan stuck to Xiao Chun and said unrelentingly, "Father, you can't find any excuses this time. You must accompany Luan Luan." Luan Luan really liked having Xiao Chun by her side. In response, Xiao Chun nodded with a doting expression. Okay. Father promises you." Now that the situation in the sword sect had gradually stabilized, Xiao Chun could hand over some trivial matters to Tsang Xing, Nangong Wan, and the rest. He could also spare some time to accompany Qin Shiru and the other ladies and Luan Luan. After hearing Xiao Chen's words, Luan Luan smiled happily. Qin Shiru and the other ladies also smiled faintly. Like Luan Luan, the ladies also hoped to be able to accompany Xiao Chun. However, at the same time, they knew that as the sect leader of the sword sect, Xiao Chun had a lot of things that were beyond his control. This was especially so in the cruel, great thousand world where danger lurked everywhere. The slightest carelessness could lead to death. Therefore, regardless of whether it was for the sake of the sword sect or to protect his family, Xiao Chun did not dare to slack off. Qin Shiru and the other ladies understood this very well. According to the agreement, in the next few days, Xiao Chun did indeed bring Qin Shiru, the ladies, and Xiao Wan to play around in the sword mansion. As the newly established sword mansion, it was indeed much larger than the original sword province. Furthermore, there were many places that even Xiao Chun had not been to before. The family toured many places together. Of course, this time, Xiao Chun and his family hid their identities and no one knew about it. In such a joyous time, half a month passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, Xiao Chun and his family had just finished their day. When they returned to the inn, they saw that Tsang Xing had been waiting for them in the courtyard for a long time. When he saw Tsang Xing, Xiao Chun handed Luan Luan, who was in his arms, to Qin Shiru and the other ladies. Luan Luan was clearly unhappy about this, but Qin Shiru comforted her. "Luan Luan, be good. Daddy has something to do." When she heard Qin Shiru's words, Luan Luan nodded obediently. At the same time, Tsang Xing took the initiative to step forward and cupped his hands. Tsang Xing greets sect leader, madams, and young Mississippi. In the sword sect, everyone knew that Luan Luan was Xiao Chen's daughter. Therefore, anyone who saw Luan Luan would address her as young Mississippi. In the face of Tsang Xing's greeting, Qin Shiru and the other ladies smiled and nodded. As the eldest among the ladies, Qin Shiru even said, "You all have a chat. We'll return to our rooms first." After that, the ladies brought Luan Luan back to their rooms. Xiao Chun and Tsang Xing went to the pavilion in the courtyard and sat down. Looking at Tsang Xing, Xiao Chun did not beat around the bush. He knew that something must have happened since Tsang Xing took the initiative to look for him. Therefore, Xiao Chun asked directly, "What's the matter?" "Sect leader, the situation in the sword mansion has become a little chaotic recently," Tsang Xing replied. "Oh, is it because of the coiling sect?" Xiao Chun asked. "No, it's not just the sword mansion. The situation in the Great Thousand World is the same. It's the same for the coiling sect." The situation in the Great Thousand World had become extremely chaotic. Upon hearing this, Xiao Chun quickly reacted. He knew that this was probably a problem brought about by the establishment of the 10 prefectures. Previously, due to the strong suppression of the various Ling Tian sects, in addition to the fact that many cultivation resources had not been distributed, the Great Thousand World was still stable for a period of time. However, this stability was more like the calm before the storm. Now that the storm had struck, chaos naturally descended upon the Great Thousand World. There was nothing strange about this. This was a problem that should have been considered when the 10 prefectures were established. Moreover, it was an unavoidable problem. Thinking about it, when the 10 prefectures were divided, various resources would be redistributed. In this way, there would naturally be situations where some forces would receive less or no cultivation resources at all. In this case, what would these forces do? Without cultivation resources, they could only perish. Therefore, they could only obtain resources through other means. The simplest way was naturally to snatch them. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2159. The development and existence of any force was inseparable from the support of various cultivation resources. This time, with the establishment of the 10 prefectures, the distribution of resources in the Great Thousand World was completely messed up, and a new round of shuffling was carried out. Under this new round of shuffling, some forces soared, while some forces fell into decline because they were not allocated sufficient cultivation resources. As a result, those forces that were not allocated cultivation resources had to think of ways to fight for sufficient cultivation resources. This was the beginning of the chaos. Such chaos was like a plague that quickly spread in the Great Thousand World. Naturally, the Sword Mansion could not avoid it. After listening to Tsang Xing briefly explain the current situation in the Sword Mansion, according to Tsang Xing, due to the influx of a large number of rogue cultivators and foreign forces in the Sword Mansion, an intense conflict broke out between the native forces and the foreign forces in the Sword Mansion. These foreign forces only had one purpose in invading the Sword Mansion, and that was to snatch resources. Naturally, the native forces in the Sword Mansion would not agree to this, so it was inevitable that a fight would break out between the two sides. Currently, it was said that the most chaotic place was Tong City, and the few cities around Tong City were the most chaotic. Firstly, Tong City's geographical location happened to be at the edge of the Sword Mansion. So when the foreign forces invaded, Tong City was naturally the first to bear the brunt. Secondly, there were more than 10 spiritual stone veins around Tong City. With so many spiritual stone veins, it was naturally the reason why so many foreign forces were attracted to Tong City. Currently, Nangongguan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan had arrived in Tong City. Due to the deterrence of the Sword Sect, the chaos in Tong City was temporarily suppressed. Although there were still conflicts from time to time, at least it was within a controllable range. Of course, this kind of suppression was obviously not a long-term solution because the various forces around Tong City had chosen to endure because of the deterrence of the Sword Sect. However, once the various cultivation resources in their sects were exhausted, conflicts would still erupt. At that time, even the Sword Sect would find it difficult to suppress them. After all, it was clearly wishful thinking for a starving beggar to listen to you, because in his eyes, there was only food. Everyone was the same. In a situation where there were no cultivation resources, the major sects were like starving beggars. When the time came, there would only be cultivation resources in their eyes, and they would no longer listen to any reason. He had temporarily stabilized the situation, but what came next was the most difficult. Of course, Xiao Chan could also choose to eliminate all of these foreign forces. This was the simplest and fastest method, but once he did so, the consequences would be extremely severe, especially the Sword Sect's reputation. Moreover, these foreign forces and sectless cultivators had all expressed their willingness to submit to the Sword Sect as long as the Sword Sect could provide them with sufficient cultivation resources. In this way, these forces were like meat in the palm of the Sword Sect's hand. To put it bluntly, this was a situation where there were too many monks and too little gruel. However, this situation was the most difficult to deal with. After all, none of the forces were willing to share their cultivation resources with other forces. After listening to Tsang Xing's explanation, Xiao Chen's expression was still calm. He poured a glass of wine for himself, and Tsang Xing, as Xiao Chen murmured softly, "Actually, we should have expected this outcome long ago. This is an inevitable result brought about by the establishment of the 10 prefectures. This is because the 10 Great Ling Tian sects have occupied most of the cultivation resources. After the establishment of the 10 prefectures, the 10 great Ling Tian sects had become the overlords of the 10 prefectures. In this way, the best cultivation resources were naturally completely occupied by the 10 great Ling Tian sects. As for the weaker forces below, what they could obtain was merely some of the scraps that the top 10 Ling Tian sects did not want. The cultivation resources were all concentrated in the hands of the 10 great Ling Tian sects, resulting in the situation where there were too many monks and too little gruel. Upon hearing Xiao Qin's words, Song Xing nodded in agreement. That's true. However, sect leader, this is the root of the problem. Moreover, if this matter is not handled properly, the 10 great Ling Tian sects, including our sword sect, will probably become the enemy of all the other forces. At that time, we'll really become enemies with the world. The 10 great Ling Tian sects occupied a lot of resources, which was the source of the conflict. If this conflict was not handled properly, the 10 great Ling Tian sects would most likely become complete enemies with the other forces in the Great Thousand World. Knowing the logic behind Song Xing's words, Xiao Qin nodded. Let's go to Tong City and take a look first. Now, it's not only the sword sect that's facing such a problem, the other Ling Tian sects are also facing the same problem. They decided to go to Tong City and take a look first. In this regard, Song Xing nodded and did not say anything else. Since they had decided to go to Tong City, naturally, they would not be able to continue accompanying Qin Shu, the girls, and Luan Luan. He expressed his apologies to the girls. In this regard, Qin Shu and the girls were very understanding and did not make things difficult for Xiao Chun. Only Luan Luan looked unhappy. In the end, after Xiao Chun repeatedly assured her, Luan Luan finally calmed down. Early the next morning, Xiao Chun asked Song Xing to arrange for the powerhouses of the sword sect to escort Qin Shu and the others back to the sword sect. Now that the situation in the Great Thousand World was very chaotic, no one knew what would happen in the end. Therefore, in Xiao Chen's opinion, only by sending Qin Shu and the others back to the sword sect would they be truly safe. After all, in today's Great Thousand World, there were not many forces that dared to directly attack the headquarters of the sword sect. Of course, there were not many forces that could do this. After settling the matter of Qin Shu and the other girls, Xiao Chen rushed all the way to Tong City, accompanied by Song Xing. While Xiao Chan was rushing to Tong City, there were more than a dozen sect leaders in the city governor's mansion of Tong City who had found Zhou Song and the other two. In the hall of the city governor's mansion, Zhou Song and the other two were sitting on the main seats. Below them, more than a dozen sect leaders of various forces were discussing with a helpless expression. Deputy sect leader, we really have no other choice. The various cultivation resources in the sword sect are simply not enough to support the cultivation of our disciples. If this goes on, our sword sect will really be finished. The forces that these sect leaders belonged to were not local forces of the sword sect. Instead, they had migrated from other prefectures in search of cultivation resources. Previously, because of the suppression of the sword sect, they had been well-behaved for a period of time. However, as time passed, they saw that there was no result, and the cultivation resources in the sword sect were decreasing day by day. Therefore, they came together in hopes that the sword sect would give them an explanation. Please add, please vote, please recommend. In a chapter. Chapter 2160. In front of Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other two, the dozen or so sect masters were all complaining endlessly, looking extremely pitiful. There was nothing they could do about it. In front of the sword sect, they didn't dare to be unreasonable. The only thing they could do was beg for mercy. Looking at the miserable faces of the dozen or so sect masters, Wu Huan, who was sitting on the main seat, immediately said impatiently, All right, what are you crying for? Look at you. Do you still have the demeanor of a sect master? Shut up. After being scolded by Wu Huan, the dozen or so sect masters finally stopped talking. However, their eyes were still looking at Wu Huan's group of three with pitiful expressions. Being stared at by so many people, Wu Huan's group of three felt extremely helpless. The current situation was indeed very difficult to deal with. They couldn't fight, they couldn't kill, and they didn't have enough resources. It was clearly a hopeless situation. As for asking the sword sect to take out cultivation resources for them, that was even more impossible. No one knew when the final battle with the heavenly sect would break out. If the sword sect still took out their cultivation resources and gave them to others, wouldn't that be courting death? In the end, Wu Huan directly threw the problem to Nangongwan. Looking at Nangongwan, he smiled helplessly and said, "Eldest senior brother, this junior brother isn't used to dealing with this kind of situation. I'll leave it to you." After saying that, without waiting for Nangongwan to reply, Wu Huan stood up and left the hall. Seeing this, Nangongwan still hadn't recovered from her shock. Beside her, Zhou Song also stood up and followed Wu Huan out of the hall, leaving behind only one sentence. "Eldest senior brother, I'll have to trouble you." Zhou Song and Wu Huan threw this hot potato to Nangongwan without any sense of loyalty. Looking at the backs of her two junior brothers, the corners of Nangongwan's mouth twitched unconsciously. She also wanted to leave, but looking at the dozen or so sect masters in front of her, they obviously wouldn't let her leave just like that. He felt a headache coming on and cursed in his heart. "You two disloyal fellows. Just you wait." Even though Nangongwan was furious, she still had to face what she had to face. She helplessly turned her gaze to the dozen or so sect masters. Suddenly, Nangongwan thought of a solution, and a faint smile appeared on her face. She looked at the crowd and calmly said, "Lord Sect Master is already on his way here. If you have any problems, we can discuss them after Lord Sect Master arrives." Nangongwan didn't hesitate in the slightest as she pushed the blame to Xiao Chun. After she finished speaking, she silently said in her heart, "Junior brother, don't blame senior brother." Senior brother had no other choice. As soon as she finished speaking, Nangongwan disappeared from the spot without waiting for anyone to reply. The dozen or so sect leaders present were also helpless. However, when they heard that Xiao Chun was about to arrive at Tong City, they felt a little better. After all, with Xiao Chun there, they should be able to solve this problem. These native powers are simply occupying the latrine, but not taking a shit. They're obviously weaker than us, but they insist on occupying the cultivation resources. That's right. We're also willing to submit to the sword sect and become its subordinate sections. In my opinion, Sect Master Xiao Chun should not help either side, and let us solve this problem with confidence. The strong have the resources, and the weak deserve to be destroyed. That's right. When Sect Master Xiao Chun arrives, we'll definitely advise him to do so. The weak are prey to the strong. That's the law of survival for us cultivators. Seeing that they definitely wouldn't be able to get an answer today, the sect leaders and sect leaders all cursed as they walked away. Of course, they spoke very softly, afraid that others would hear them. After all, the City Lord's mansion was currently filled with members of the Sword Sect. Although their words didn't involve the Sword Sect, it still wouldn't be good if the experts of the Sword Sect heard them. What the sect leaders meant was that the Sword Sect wouldn't help either side and let them fight to their heart's content. Who would get how much cultivation resources would depend entirely on their own strength. This proposal wasn't unacceptable to the Sword Sect, but with Xiao Qin's personality, he definitely wouldn't do it so early. This was because although the Sword Sect would have an easier time, the native powers of the Sword Sect who had previously submitted to the Sword Sect would be bitterly disappointed. They had chosen the Sword Sect, but in the end, the Sword Sect didn't provide them with any protection. What would the other forces who had submitted to the Sword Sect think about this? Therefore, in the long run, this approach was obviously more harmful than beneficial. It wasn't advisable. For the time being, the situation in Tong City was stabilized. 2 days later, Xiao Chun and Song Xing's group successfully arrived in Tong City. In the City Lord's mansion, Nangongwan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan gave a simple report of the situation in Tong City to Xiao Chun. Hearing this, Xiao Chun smiled bitterly and helplessly. Leaving them alone and not helping either side. I can't believe they came up with this idea. As soon as he finished speaking, Song Xing received a letter. A golden light directly entered Song Xing's forehead. After reading the letter, Song Xing looked at Xiao Chun and said, Sect leader, according to the latest news, the turmoil in the Dan Valley Talisman sect and Tool sect has been quelled. The turmoil in the Dan Valley's Heavenly Pill Prefecture, the Talisman sect's 100 Spirits Prefecture, and the Tool sect's 10,000 Weapons Prefecture had been quelled so quickly. The news came from the Sword sect's headquarters, so there shouldn't be any mistake. Hearing Song Xing's words, Xiao Chun was a little surprised. So fast. How did they do it? The situation in the vast Thousand Worlds was now on the verge of erupting into chaos, but the Dan Valley and Tool sect had actually quelled it in less than 3 days. This was something that Xiao Chun didn't expect. Looking at the Sword sect now, Xiao Chun was still worried about this, but the Dan Valley and Tool sect had quelled it. After hearing Xiao Chun's words, Song Xing's expression became a little strange. The three of them took out their resources and distributed them to other forces. The Dan Valley and Tool sect's method of quelling the chaos was very simple, and that was to generously distribute their resources to other forces. This way, the chaos would naturally be quelled. Xiao Chun was stunned when he heard Song Xing's words, but he quickly regained his senses and smiled helplessly. They're really rich and overbearing. It's easy to get things done when you're rich. He didn't expect the Dan Valley and Tool sect's method to be so simple. However, among the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, only the 3 of them could do such a thing. After all, the wealth of the Dan Valley, Talisman sect, and Tool sect was undoubtedly the most stable in the vast Thousand Worlds. Among the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, there were many opinions about which sect was the most powerful. However, if one were to talk about which sect was the richest, there was no doubt that it was the Dan Valley, Tool sect, and Talisman sect. Due to their unique characteristics, the wealth of these 3 sects was naturally much more than the other Ling Tian sects. They could be said to be very rich and overbearing, begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2161. Dan Valley, Tool sect, and Talisman sect. These 3 major forces had used money to settle this matter, but the Sword sect obviously couldn't do this. The Sword sect didn't even have enough cultivation resources for themselves, let alone the other major forces. Xiao Chun shook his head helplessly and said, "First, seal off the Sword Mansion. From today onwards, no one is allowed to enter. As for other matters, I will think about it carefully." He hadn't thought of a good solution for the time being, but it was crucial to limit the number of cultivators entering the Jin province. He couldn't allow more rogue cultivators and forces to enter the Sword Mansion. Otherwise, the pressure on the Sword sect would only increase. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Song Xing, Nangongguan, and the others nodded in agreement. Sealing off the Sword Mansion was something that must be done. This was the only thing they could do for the time being. However, compared to other places, the situation in the Sword Mansion was still pretty good. It was said that the Heavenly Sect had begun to expel the foreign forces in the Heitian province. They had even destroyed 2 or 3 forces. The Heavenly Sect's methods were obviously tougher, but there was nothing they could do about it. Like Xiao Chun, Yang Chun naturally couldn't distribute the cultivation resources of the Heavenly Sect to other forces. Moreover, the major spirit stone veins in the Heitian province already had owners and couldn't be redistributed. Therefore, the best way was to expel the foreign forces and cultivators. However, Xiao Chun didn't want to do this. Or rather, Xiao Chun wasn't willing to use this method until the last moment. The matter of sealing off the Sword Mansion was completely handed over to Song Xing and the others. Xiao Chun hadn't thought of a good solution for several days. In addition, the sect masters and sect masters of the foreign forces would come to the City Lord Mansion every day to inquire about the matter, which made Xiao Chun a little upset. Feeling a little depressed, Xiao Chun strolled alone on the streets of Tong City. Perhaps because of the chaotic situation in Tong City, the originally bustling streets had become somewhat bleak at this moment. The shops on both sides of the street were only open in 2s and 3s, and there weren't many people on the street, only a few people. Every time an upheaval broke out, the ones who were affected the most were not the martial artists, but the ordinary people who lived at the bottom and had no cultivation. This was because they did not have any ability to protect themselves in front of cultivators. They could be killed at any time. Moreover, the outbreak of chaos was, to put it bluntly, the collapse of the rules. With the collapse of the rules that could originally restrain cultivators, some malicious or cruel cultivators no longer had any scruples in their actions. As a result, those ordinary people without any cultivation would naturally suffer. Xiao Chun sighed as he looked at the scattered commoners coming and going. But suddenly, Xiao Chun thought of an idea that had been planted in Xiao Chen's mind. Xiao Chun still remembered that when he took over Bazhou, he was faced with many ordinary people who had no cultivation. At that time, he had thought that if he were to become powerful enough one day, he would definitely give everyone a chance to cultivate. He didn't ask for their cultivation to be high, but at least they would have some opportunities to cultivate or be free from the invasion of illness. He had always had this idea, but he had to put it aside temporarily due to various reasons. But now it seemed possible. Thinking of this, Xiao Chen's eyes unconsciously flashed with a glint. He immediately turned around and returned to the city lord mansion. In the garden, Xiao Chun pondered alone for more than 4 hours. After perfecting some details, Xiao Chun increasingly felt that his idea was feasible. Originally, he hadn't implemented this method mainly because there weren't any extra cultivators in the sword sect who knew how to cultivate. One had to know that in order for everyone to be able to cultivate, the amount of manpower needed was not a small number. After all, for those ordinary people who had never come into contact with martial arts, their talent was not high. It was almost impossible for them to be self-taught. Therefore, it was necessary to have a martial artist as a teacher to teach them the knowledge of cultivation. According to the scale of Xiao Chen's idea, a martial arts courtyard would be set up in every city. Every martial arts courtyard, even the smallest one, would need at least 10 cultivators. As a result, the number of cultivators required would naturally be many. It was impossible for the sword sect to spare so many people to manage this matter. But now, the manpower problem was obviously solved. Now that so many foreign forces and independent cultivators had entered the sword mansion, it wasn't impossible to build the martial arts courtyard system that Xiao Chun envisioned in the sword mansion with them as the foundation. Moreover, by using these people to set up martial arts courtyards, the matter of cultivation resources would naturally be solved. After all, Xiao Chun would also charge some fees to enter the martial arts courtyards. Of course, it wouldn't be too high. However, the scattered fees for each person shouldn't be underestimated. It should be known that the martial arts courtyards that Xiao Chun envisioned were different from ordinary martial arts courtyards. Previously, the martial arts courtyards in the Great Thousand World were basically open to the disciples of the big families. The fees were very high, and the number of students was destined to be small. For example, the Heavenly Policy Mansion was actually transformed from a martial arts courtyard. However, the martial arts courtyards that Xiao Chun envisioned were mainly targeted at the ordinary people. Therefore, the fees wouldn't be too high. However, due to the large number of people, the fees that seemed low were definitely not a small sum when added up. Moreover, the martial arts courtyards that Xiao Chun envisioned weren't for the elite. Xiao Chun also didn't intend to cultivate the ordinary people into peerless powerhouses or to have a high cultivation base. In this way, the consumption of cultivation resources for the martial arts courtyards wouldn't be a big problem. They only needed some basic cultivation resources and elixirs. To put it bluntly, the prices of these cultivation resources and elixirs were simply extremely cheap. To put it bluntly, there were still many similar basic cultivation resources piled up in the sword sect. Normally, no one would use and pay attention to them. It was a complete waste. In this way, these cultivation resources would be used to set up the martial arts courtyards. After the martial arts courtyards were on the right track, they would be self-sufficient. Not only would this solve the current problem, but it would also greatly increase the prestige of the sword sect. Who could guarantee that there wouldn't be a few geniuses among the ordinary people? With so many people, it could be said that they would act as backup troops for the sword sect. Once there were good seedlings, they could be recruited into the sword sect. It could be said that it was killing two birds with one stone. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was feasible. Xiao Chen also couldn't wait to say to the maidservant beside him, "Go and invite the deputy sect masters here." Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2162. Qing Yao, Qing Luo, Fei Mei, and Anlin didn't follow Xiao Chen to Tong City this time. The maids in charge of serving Xiao Chen were also selected from the Tong City's city lord residents. Qing Yao, Qing Luo, Fei Mei, and Anlin didn't follow Xiao Chen to Tong City this time. The maids in charge of serving Xiao Chen were also selected from the Tong City's city lord residents. After spending some time with Xiao Chen and being in charge of serving Xiao Chen's daily needs, the maids were extremely nervous. After all, Xiao Chen was a big shot, and they had never come into contact with such a big shot in their lives. In fact, Xiao Chen was almost like a legendary figure to them. Therefore, after hearing Xiao Chen's words, the maids were taken aback. After a few moments, they returned to their senses and hurriedly bowed respectfully. "Please forgive me, sir. All right, go and invite the deputy sect masters over." Xiao Chen waved his hand nonchalantly. After seeing that Xiao Chen didn't blame her, the maid ran out of the courtyard and went to invite Song Xing and the others over. Looking at the back of the maid, Xiao Chen shook his head and let out a bitter smile. She really wasn't as handy as Qing Yao, Qing Luo, and the others. But then again, after all, they had been by his side for so many years and had developed a tacit understanding with each other. Most of the time, they would know what Xiao Chen meant with just a glance. Shortly after, Song Xing and the others arrived and sat around the gazebo. Xiao Chen explained his idea for the establishment of the martial arts academy to everyone in detail. After hearing Xiao Chen's idea for the martial arts academy, Song Xing and the others were taken aback, but they immediately praised him. Song Xing and the others weren't praising Xiao Chen because they felt that Xiao Chen's idea was great. Song Xing was the first to speak. Establishing a martial arts academy can indeed solve the current problem. Not only that, but if it's really as Sectmaster said, once the martial arts academy is established, all of the students will become the reserved disciples of our sword sect. There will definitely be many outstanding talents among them. This way, we can ensure that our sword sect will always have new blood, and there won't be a shortage of fresh blood. Upon hearing Song Xing's words, Nangong added. Both of them were full of praises for the martial arts academy idea. However, Zhou Song raised an objection at this moment. Sectmaster wants to set up a martial courtyard and let the people from the various major powers be in charge of the martial courtyard. Will they agree? Moreover, in the end, will the students of the martial arts academy be loyal to the sword sect or to them? Zhou Song was a little worried. Upon hearing this, Song Xing and the others fell into deep thought. Indeed, Zhou Song's words weren't without reason. After all, according to Xiao Chen's idea, the martial arts academy would be completely managed by the various powers because the sword sect definitely wouldn't be able to spare so many people to deal with the martial arts academy. However, in this way, the disciples of the martial arts academy would naturally come into contact with the members of the various powers. They would be even more unfamiliar with the sword sect. Therefore, in the end, it was hard to say if all of the students would be loyal to the sword sect. In the face of Zhou Song's worries, Xiao Chen nodded in agreement. Second senior brother is right. However, I've only just thought of the martial arts academy idea. There are definitely many imperfections. That's fine. We'll just have to slowly come up with a plan. The martial art academy's idea was definitely imperfect. There were many loopholes and problems. However, this didn't matter much. As long as this method was feasible, they would definitely be able to find a solution together. Song Xing and the others nodded in agreement when they heard Xiao Chen's words. Indeed, as long as the method was feasible, there would definitely be a solution to the problem. They all agreed to use the Martial Arts Academy's method to solve the Sword Mansion's current predicament. As for the other problems, they would continue to think of ways to solve them. Xiao Chen had already thought of a solution. All they had to do now was continue to perfect it. As for the other sects, apart from the Dan Valley, the Talisman sect, and the Armament sect who were rich and overbearing, they directly used money to solve the problem. The other sects were still using force to deal with the problem. In the Saber sect, Dao Ju sat in the courtyard in a relaxed manner. He drank fine wine as he listened to a deputy sect leader of the Saber sect report the current situation in the Saber Mansion. The situation in the Saber Mansion was similar to that in the Sword Mansion. Some of the forces that were not allocated enough resources had begun to riot. Dao Ju's solution was even simpler. He would let the major forces fight among themselves. For 3 months, all the forces in the Saber Mansion could fight each other for the cultivation resources. After 3 months, no matter who had the cultivation resources, the dust would settle. Otherwise, the Saber sect would intervene. Dao Ju's solution caused the situation in the Saber Mansion to become more and more chaotic. However, the deputy sect leader couldn't do anything about it. The outside world was already in a mess, but Dao Ju acted as if nothing had happened. Looking at the worried look on the deputy sect leader's face, Dao Ju said lazily, "All right, it'll be fine after 3 months. Right now, none of these forces are willing to submit to the other. Since that's the case, let them fight. The winner takes it all. When the time comes, they won't have any complaints." "But sect leader, the deputy sect leader said worriedly. However, before he finished his sentence, Dao Ju stood up and said in a bored tone, "Sect leader, all right. It's settled. Don't bother about them for the next 3 months. Let them fight. After 3 months, take action." After that, without waiting for the deputy sect leader's reply, Dao Ju stood up and returned to his room. The situation in the Saber Mansion had become even more chaotic due to Dao Ju's willfulness. It had completely become a place where strength determined victory or defeat. In the Heavenly Harmony residence, Yang Qin's solution was also simple. However, unlike Dao Ju, he didn't let things go. For those forces and cultivators who entered the Heavenly Harmony residence and wanted to snatch cultivation resources, Yang Song's attitude was only one: kill. He used brutal means and strength to suppress the chaos in the Heavenly Harmony residence. Although the method was a bit rough, the effect was really good. Along with the strong force of the He Tian Mansion, after destroying 2 or 3 forces and killing many independent cultivators, the chaos in the He Tian Mansion was indeed quickly calmed down. The forces that were initially at loggerheads no longer dared to attack each other for fear of being punished by the Heavenly Harmony residence. It seemed like the chaos in the Heavenly Harmony residence had been resolved, but in fact, it was only on the surface. The forces were all intimidated by the Heavenly Harmony residence's strength, so they didn't dare to make any moves for the time being. But even so, Yang Qin's brutal means had indeed temporarily resolved the problem in the Heavenly Harmony residence, at least on the surface. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2163. Dao Ju, Yang Chun, Li Chun, and Xiao Xiao were using their own methods to deal with the current chaotic situation in the Great Thousand World. Dao Ju, Yang Chun, Li Chun, and Xiao Xiao were using their own methods to deal with the current chaotic situation in the Great Thousand World. Xiao Chun, who was in Tong City, gradually perfected the concept of the martial institution after a few days of discussion with Song Xing and the rest. They also found a way to resolve Zhou Song's objection. Zhou Song was initially worried that after the establishment of the martial institution, it would be handed over to the major forces to handle. In this case, would the students of the martial institution be loyal to the sword sect or the major forces in the end? Xiao Chun and the rest discussed and found a way to resolve this issue, which was to merge all the foreign forces into the sword sect. After merging into the sword sect, everyone would belong to the sword sect, and the previous problem would no longer exist. As for whether they were willing or not, it was no longer up to them. If they were unwilling, they could only be expelled from the sword sect or be annihilated by the sword sect. This was the best solution and could also strengthen the strength of the sword sect. After perfecting the concept of the martial institution, There was no hurry to deal with the other issues in the future. On this day, Xiao Chun, Song Xing, and the rest gathered the sect masters and sect masters of the major foreign forces around Tong City, as well as some reputable and powerful rogue cultivators in the governor's mansion. There were about 30 to 40 of them. Xiao Chun was anxious about these people. Everyone gathered in the main hall, while Xiao Chun sat on the main seat. Facing Xiao Chun, the many sect leaders and sect leaders present did not dare to show the slightest bit of disrespect. They all respectfully greeted him. In response, Xiao Chun nodded slightly, and then slowly opened his mouth to speak. Everyone, I've gathered all of you here today to discuss the current situation. I'm sure all of you have been in Tong City for a long time, and you should be aware of the current situation in the Sword Mansion and the entire Great Thousand World. Xiao Chun was here to resolve the difficulties faced by everyone. Upon hearing Xiao Chun's words, everyone revealed expectant looks and waited for him to continue. Xiao Chun didn't beat around the bush and bluntly explained the establishment of the martial institution. At the same time, he requested everyone to join the Sword Sect if they wanted to stay in the Sword Mansion. Otherwise, they would be expelled. After hearing what Xiao Chun said, the expressions of everyone present changed. They all had different expressions, but everyone fell into silence. As a matter of fact, they weren't too conflicted about Xiao Chun's establishment of the martial institution. After all, the Sword Sect would be responsible for all the expenses in the early stages. Besides, if they worked in the martial institution, they would receive cultivation resources every month, and the specific allocation would depend on their cultivation base and position. No one objected to the establishment of the martial institution. What made them conflicted or hesitant was the fact that their sect had to be merged into the Sword Sect. This made it difficult for them to make a decision. It was especially so for the sect masters and sect masters of the major forces. After all, they were sect masters and naturally wouldn't be willing to merge into other forces easily. In this case, wouldn't it mean that their sects would cease to exist? Unlike the hesitation of the sect masters and sect masters, the itinerant cultivators were much more decisive. After all, itinerant cultivators were all alone in the world. With the changes in the Great Thousand World, they knew that it would be increasingly difficult for itinerant cultivators to survive in the Great Thousand World in the future. This was because the Great Thousand World had become an era where the 10 great Lingtian sects and the Sword Sect were competing for hegemony. Without a strong background, it would be difficult to make any achievements in the great wide world in the future by relying only on one person's strength. Even if one could survive, it would be difficult for one to make any big achievements. Obviously, one would not have a good life. Therefore, the representatives of the itinerant cultivators were different from the sect masters and quickly made a decision. They cupped their hands and bowed to Xiao Chun. Sect Master, Xiao Chun thinks highly of us. We are fearful and are willing to join the Sword Sect. The representatives of the itinerant cultivators all expressed their willingness to join the Sword Sect. Xiao Chun smiled and said, "Everyone, you are too serious. Since you have joined the Sword Sect, you are a family. As long as you are loyal to the Sword Sect will not disappoint you." Xiao Chun had expected that the itinerant cultivator representatives would join. However, when he looked at them, Xiao Chun couldn't help but rejoice in his heart. Although there weren't any End Realm experts among them, there were 2 Dao Realm experts. Moreover, the others were all in the Comprehension Realm. Their joining the Sword Sect would undoubtedly be of great help to the Sword Sect. Moreover, what Xiao Chun was more interested in was that with the addition of these people, they would definitely bring more itinerant cultivators to join the Sword Sect. In this way, the strength of the Sword Sect would increase imperceptibly. Of course, Xiao Chun naturally wouldn't completely trust them. Moreover, even if they joined the Sword Sect, he still needed to observe them for a period of time in the future to see if they were really willing to share honor and disgrace with the Sword Sect. He needed to test their loyalty to the Sword Sect. Of course, Xiao Chun didn't need to worry about these things. Song Xing and the others would naturally take care of it. Xiao Chun smiled and nodded to the itinerant cultivator representatives. After he said that, he looked at the sect leaders and said without a change in expression, "Sect leaders, what do you think? Have you thought it through?" These sect leaders were obviously having a harder time making a decision than the itinerant cultivators. Therefore, when faced with Xiao Chen's question, more than 10 of them actually chose to remain silent. No one stood out to reply. All of them lowered their heads and remained silent. Seeing this, Xiao Chen's eyes flashed with a cold smile. These fellows wanted to protect their own sects and forces and also wanted a share of the Sword Mansion. How could such a good thing happen? The Sword Mansion would always belong to the Sword Sect. This was something that couldn't be changed. Therefore, Xiao Chen's bottom line was that they could either merge with the Sword Sect or disband their sects and lead those who were willing to merge with the Sword Sect. Otherwise, they could be expelled from the Sword Mansion or be destroyed by the Sword Sect. Xiao Chen's voice gradually turned a little cold as he looked at the sect leaders who had fallen silent. Everyone should know that there's no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Since you don't want to merge with the Sword Sect, but you also want a share of the Sword Mansion, I don't think there's such a good thing in this world. Today, I've given you my answer. As for how you choose, it's up to you. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. In a chapter. Chapter 2164. Xiao Chen said nonchalantly. Upon hearing this, the expressions of the 10 over sect leaders changed slightly. There was anger, fear, and fear. They were angry because Xiao Chen was obviously asking them to disband their sects and merge with the Sword Sect. They were afraid because they were afraid of the Sword Sect's strength. Compared to the Sword Sect, their forces were like ants. However, there were some people who were not afraid of death in this world. After hearing Xiao Chen's words, one of the sect leaders stood out and looked at Xiao Chen stubbornly. Sect leader Xiao Chen, aren't you being a little ungentlemanly by doing this? Oh, how am I being ungentlemanly? Upon hearing this, Xiao Chen could not help but chuckle. In the face of Xiao Chen's question, the sect leader's expression remained unchanged as he said, "The Sword Sect is now a great force that's on par with the 10 great Ling Tian sects. However, you're using your strength to bully the weak and want to merge with us. Isn't this ungentlemanly? I think if this matter were to spread out, it would probably damage the Sword Sect's reputation. Isn't that right, sect leader Xiao Chen?" This sect leader's character was obviously the stubborn type. It could even be said that he was a little paranoid. He actually said such disrespectful words in front of Xiao Chen. As expected, as soon as his words left his mouth, Song Xing, who was standing to the left of Xiao Chen, shouted angrily, "How dare you?" Following Song Xing's angry shout, a majestic and terrifying aura surged out and instantly surged toward everyone present. Under the pressure of Song Xing's majestic aura, everyone present knelt on the ground. However, only the sect leader who had spoken earlier resisted Song Xing's aura. He gritted his teeth and refused to kneel no matter what. One had to say that this elder's strength and aura were not weak. He was the strongest person present with the highest cultivation. He was at the great circle of the Tao realm and was about to break through to the end realm. In Xiao Chen's eyes, this person had the possibility of breaking through to the end realm. He was indeed a good person. However, it was a pity that he was not used by Xiao Chen. Seeing that this person refused to kneel under his aura, Song Xing could not help but be furious. He increased his aura once again and shouted angrily, "Kneel!" As he spoke, the majestic aura increased once again. This time, Song Xing focused his aura on this person. In front of such a powerful aura, in the end, this sect leader's legs could not take it anymore and slowly bent down. In the end, he knelt in front of Xiao Chen. Looking at the sect leader who knelt in front of him, Xiao Chen's expression did not change. One could not see any anger on his face as he spoke calmly. "Bullying the weak? You entered the Sword Mansion without permission and wanted to divide the cultivation resources within the Sword Mansion. Firstly, I did not attack you. Secondly, I did not use force to suppress you. How can you say that I am bullying the weak? Secondly, you want to divide the cultivation resources of the Sword Mansion but do not want to give up anything. In the end, you say that I am bullying the weak. Don't you think that is too much of a joke? I propose the idea of opening a martial arts academy for the sake of the people of the world. However, you only want benefits and do not want to give up anything. Do you think that my sword sect is a bunch of idiots? Xiao Chun asked 3 questions in a row. Facing this, the sect leader could not answer because of the huge pressure from Song Xing. He could only grit his teeth and endure. He no longer had the energy to answer Xiao Chun's questions. Xiao Chun did not care about this. After he finished speaking, Xiao Chun paused for a moment before looking at the sect leaders present. I will give you 3 days. After 3 days, I must obtain an answer. Those who are willing to merge with the sword sect will be a family from now on. Those who are unwilling, I will give you a chance to leave the sword mansion. As for those who are unwilling to merge with the sword sect or leave the sword mansion, I can only make them stay here forever. Merging with the sword sect was Xiao Chun's bottom line. He could not give in because if he did not do so, the sword mansion would not be able to stabilize completely. In this way, Xiao Chun would be burying a time bomb that could explode at any time in his own courtyard. Xiao Chun naturally would not do such a stupid thing. In the end, he gave everyone 3 days to think. In the end, the frost python in Xiao Chun's eyes increased greatly. He looked at the dozen sect leaders and sternly warned them. Here, in the sword mansion, my words are the rules and the law. I hope that everyone knows whose territory the sword mansion is. Otherwise, don't blame me for being merciless. After he finished speaking, Xiao Chun nodded slightly at Song Xing. Seeing this, Song Xing retracted his pressure. At the same time, the sect leader who had spoken out against Xiao Chun was already sweating profusely. At the same time, his face was much paler. In order to resist Song Xing's pressure, the sect leader was indeed exhausted. Although he was at the Tao realm great perfection, he had not broken through to the end realm. It seemed like a small difference, but in reality, it was like the difference between heaven and earth. After all, not everyone could be like Xiao Chun and the other geniuses, having the strength to fight against end realm experts of the Tao realm. Song Xing retracted his pressure. Nangongwan also spoke up at the right time. Let's go. In 3 days, we must make a choice. 3 days was the ultimatum that Xiao Chun had given. It was also the last time that couldn't be changed. Hearing this, the dozen sect leaders and sect leaders didn't dare to have any objections. They immediately left the main hall, including the sect leader who had spoken out against Xiao Chun. Xiao Chun not killing this sect leader on the spot was already very merciful. After all, as the sect leader of the sword sect, Xiao Chun could easily go against anyone. After the dozen or so sect masters and headmasters left, only the dozen or so individual cultivator representatives who had agreed to join the sword gate were left in the hall. Now that there were no outsiders, Xiao Chun stood up and walked up to the dozen or so people. He personally helped the Tao realm expert who was leading the group up and said with a kind expression, "Everyone, in the future, the world will enter a brand new era. In this new era, if you want to do something, you can't rely on your own strength. Everyone has to work together. Since you have chosen to join the sword sect, although you might lose the freedom of wandering cultivators and be bound by the rules of the sword sect, at the same time, the sword sect can provide you with protection. In the future, no matter where you are, the sword sect will always be your strong backing. Moreover, in the future, you can slowly experience that the sword sect is not a sect with complicated rules. As long as you don't betray the sword sect, you can still live freely and cultivate. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 2165. Xiao Chun wasn't lying. The sword sect wasn't a sect with complicated rules. It could even be said that the sword sect had very few rules compared to other sections. In the sword sect, from the sect master to the ordinary disciples, there weren't any restrictions on them. As long as they completed the tasks assigned by the sect, they could use the rest of their time as they wished. This was also led by Xiao Chun. When Xiao Chun had just succeeded as the sect master of the sword sect, Xiao Chun had boldly and decisively removed many of the cumbersome rules left behind by the Sword Sect. Therefore, in the Sword Sect, everyone was relatively free. Of course, the prerequisite was that you had to be loyal to the Sword Sect. That was the bottom line. However, based on the current situation, it was precisely because of the preferential treatment that the Sword Sect gave to its disciples that the cohesion of the Sword Sect had reached an unprecedented level. If it wasn't for this, the Sword Sect wouldn't have been able to withstand the continuous attacks of the Heavenly Sect if they hadn't worked together. When they heard Xiao Chen's words, the dozen or so rogue cultivators respectfully bowed and said, "Thank you, Sect Master." These people had just joined the Sword Sect. Currently, it was impossible to determine whether they were sincere or were forced by the situation. However, Xiao Chan was confident that once these people truly joined the Sword Sect, they wouldn't regret their decision today. The matter of the rogue cultivators was relatively easy to resolve. Following that, Xiao Chan assigned a few tasks to these people and allowed them to leave the City Lord's mansion. In the following period of time, these rogue cultivators would do their best to persuade the other rogue cultivators to join the Sword Sect. Those who weren't willing to join would naturally have to leave the Sword Manor. As for the rogue cultivators, this was only temporary. The real headache for Xiao Chan was the people from the various sections. It was much more difficult to persuade them to join the Sword Sect than to recruit rogue cultivators. After all, rogue cultivators had no ties and didn't have many concerns. However, it was different for sections. It could even be said that some of the sect masters were unwilling to join the Sword Sect, because once they did so, wouldn't their sects be destroyed? In order to make these sects choose, Xiao Chun had to add fuel to the fire. However, all of this would have to wait for 3 days. He had already handed the choice to everyone. At the same time, the dozen or so sect masters who had left the City Lord's mansion gathered together. Among them, the sect master who had openly spoken against Xiao Chun was the strongest. The sect master said coldly as he sat on the main seat and looked at the crowd below. "The Sword's Gate wants to annex us. Isn't it obvious that they want to annihilate us? Everyone, although our sects can't be compared to the Sword's Gate, we have also gone through many years of development to achieve what we have today. Are you all really willing to give up your sects just like that?" The sect master was obviously trying to incite everyone's emotions. Hearing his words, everyone present chimed in one after another. "Yes, that's right. Why should we give up all our years of hard work for nothing? That's right. The Sword Sect has really gone too far this time." Due to this person's incitement, everyone's emotions quickly became agitated. Thinking about it, as the leader of a sect, he had a hand over the sect that he had painstakingly established to someone else. No matter who it was, they would not feel good. When the sect leader saw that the crowd had become agitated, a smile flashed across his eyes. Then, he opened his mouth and spoke in a timely manner. "Everyone, now that things have come to this, we can only unite. Only then can we have a place in the Sword Mansion and in the Great Thousand World. Although the Sword Sect is strong, I don't believe that the Sword Sect can cover the sky with one hand in the Great Thousand World. I once had an acquaintance with an elder of the shrines. We can contact the shrines. As long as we unite closely, the Sword Sect has nothing to fear." The sect master wanted to unite all the sect masters and sect masters present, and secretly contact the shrines to tangle with the Sword Sect. After speaking, in front of everyone present, the sect master immediately contacted the shrine's elder that he spoke of through the sound transmission talisman. Seeing that the sect master was acquainted with the shrines, and thinking that they would have the support of the shrines, the crowd's courage grew, and they began to speak loudly. Everyone wanted to unite to fight against the Sword Sect. Little did they know that after they finished their discussion, one of the sect masters present personally went to look for Xiao Chun that night. In the backyard of the governor's mansion, Xiao Chun met the sect master. He was a middle-aged man with an ordinary appearance, and one could even say that he was a little wretched. His eyes were long and thin, and he gave off the impression that he was a monkey. Among all the external forces that had entered the Sword Mansion this time, this person was obviously the most inconspicuous. At the same time, the strength of his sect was not considered strong. In the entire sect, he was the only one with a cultivation base at the comprehension state. The strongest among the others was only at the celestial emperor state. However, even he himself probably did not expect that because of his choice today, he would become one of the vice sect masters of the Sword's Gate in the future. He would become one of the few powerhouses in the entire Great Thousand World, and he would have great power and authority. Of course, this was all in the future. At this moment, Xiao Qian calmly sipped his tea as he faced the person who had taken the initiative to look for him. It's already so late. Why are you looking for me so sneakily? In fact, Xiao Qian had no impression of this person at all. After all, this person was indeed too inconspicuous. Although this person was present during the day, Xiao Qian did not pay any attention to him at all. In the face of Xiao Qian's question and being so close to Xiao Qian, the sect master could not help but feel a little nervous. After all, the person sitting in front of him was the sect master of the Sword Sect, an existence that was on par with the 10 Great Ling Tian sects. Suppressing the fear and nervousness in his heart, the sect leader lowered his head, not daring to look directly at Xiao Qian. His voice was a little soft, and there was even a trace of trembling in it. Sir, after I left the city governor's mansion today, I had a gathering with the other sect masters. During that time, the sect master recounted to Xiao Qian what the sect masters had done and said after leaving the city governor's mansion during the day. Of course, he also said that the leader had contacted the elders of shrines in an attempt to use the shrines to keep the sword sect in check. At the same time, these sects had banded together to fight against the sword sect and make the sword sect retreat in the face of difficulties so that they could occupy a place in the sword mansion. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2166. Upon hearing the sect leader's words, he thought that Xiao Qian would fly into a rage. However, after he finished speaking, he did not receive a reply from Xiao Qian for a long time. For a moment, the sect leader began to feel a little uneasy. He did not know what Xiao Qian was thinking. Upon hearing the sect leader's words, he thought that Xiao Qian would fly into a rage. However, after he finished speaking, he did not receive a reply from Xiao Qian for a long time. For a moment, the sect leader began to feel a little uneasy. He did not know what Xiao Qian was thinking. In fact, the sect leader did not have much resistance to merging his sect into the sword sect. Firstly, it was because his sect was not strong to begin with. It was a very small sect force. Secondly, he was the one who founded the sect and did not have a complicated history. As such, he could easily merge his sect into the sword sect. Lastly, it was also because of his personal reasons. He knew that the competition in the Great Thousand World would become more intense in the future. For a small sect like his, it would only be more difficult to survive in the future. Instead of that, he might as well find a big tree and hug it tightly. After all, everyone knew that it was better to lean on a big tree for shade. It was precisely because of the above considerations that he secretly came to meet Xiao Qian. He wanted to gain some credit when he joined the sword sect. This way, it would be easier for him to mingle in the sword sect. After not receiving a reply from Xiao Qian for a long time, the sect leader began to feel a little uneasy. A thin layer of sweat unconsciously appeared on his back, and his clothes were gradually drenched in sweat. However, just as the sect leader was getting more and more nervous and was about to reach his limit, he heard Xiao Qian speak slowly. "Raise your head." After hearing Xiao Qian's words, the sect leader carefully raised his head. Xiao Qian also took the opportunity to ask, "What's your name?" "Sect Master. My name is Tian Nong," Tian Nong replied cautiously. Tian Nong. Hearing this, Xiao Qian murmured softly. Then, as if talking to himself, he said, "You are a very smart person." Tian Nong took the initiative to find him and told him the truth about the affairs between the major sections. Although it seemed a little disgraceful, Xiao Qian was not disgusted by it. Perhaps this Tian Nong was a little cowardly and even a little opportunistic, but as long as his heart was with the sword sect, or if he was on his side, that was enough. As for the rest, Xiao Qian could tolerate it. He knew what Tian Nong was thinking, and he also knew the purpose of Tian Nong's actions. That was why Xiao Chan said that Tian Nong was very smart. However, after hearing this, Tian Nong was so scared that he immediately knelt down on the ground and said repeatedly, Tian Nong, you're right. Please forgive me, sect master. I know my mistake. Tian Nong thought that Xiao Chan was angry at him. After all, who would like a two-faced person? However, looking at the frightened Tian Nong, Xiao Chan interrupted him before he could finish his sentence. All right, although your actions are disgraceful, I am not that narrow-minded. But there is one thing you need to remember. People can be opportunistic, but they can't be two-faced. After joining the Sword Sect, you were born as a member of the Sword Sect, and you will die as a member of the Sword Sect. If you dare to betray the Sword Sect one day, believe me, I have 10,000 ways to make you regret it. Seeing that Xiao Chan had no intention of blaming him, Tian Nong secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he nodded respectfully and replied, Don't worry, Sect Master. I will never betray the Sword Sect in this lifetime. If I do, may the heavens strike me with lightning. All right, get up, Xiao Chen said with a smile after seeing Tian Nong's solemn expression. Tian Nong stood up, but he still appeared to be very cautious. On the other hand, Xiao Chen didn't care too much about this. He even took the initiative to invite Tian Nong to sit down and personally brewed a cup of tea for him. Tian Nong was touched and nervous when he saw Xiao Chen personally brewing tea for him. He sat on the ground beside Xiao Chen and felt as though he was sitting on pins and needles. After pouring a cup of tea for Tian Nong, Xiao Chen didn't say anything else. He sipped his tea and leisurely looked at the night sky. Since Xiao Chen didn't speak, Tian Nong naturally didn't dare to interrupt. At the same time, he didn't dare to leave. He originally thought that Xiao Chen would continue to be silent, but after about 10 minutes, Xiao Chen suddenly spoke. Tian Nong, there are so many stars in the sky, but why is it that the light they emit still can't compare to the moon? Xiao Chen seemed to be asking casually, but the smart Tian Nong immediately understood Xiao Chen's intention. He immediately cupped his hands respectfully and replied, Sect Master, how can a firefly compete with the bright moon? Haha, that's right. Then what do you think our sword sect should do if all the major sects join forces? Hearing this, Xiao Chen laughed and immediately asked, What should the sword sect do in the face of more than 10 sects joining forces? Xiao Chen's question was indeed a bit tricky, especially for Tian Nong. After all, he hadn't officially joined the sword sect yet. Therefore, when answering Xiao Chen's question, he had to be extremely careful. If he said the wrong thing, it was very likely that Xiao Chen would be unhappy. The consequences were unimaginable. He couldn't answer carelessly, but at the same time, he could not answer. Fortunately, Tian Nong was extremely good at reading people's minds. After thinking for a moment, he opened his mouth and replied. Replying to Sect Master, the sword sect is like the bright moon in the sky, and the other sects are like fireflies. How can a mere firefly compete with the bright moon? Therefore, even if these factions join forces and want to compete with the sword sect, in this little one's opinion, they're just seeking their own deaths. Sect Master only needs to lightly move his finger and you can easily crush them. Therefore, there is no need to take it to heart. Tian Nong's answer was indeed Xiao Chen's heart, and it was indeed what Xiao Chen was thinking. When he heard that these factions wanted to join forces to compete with the sword sect, Xiao Chen didn't take this matter to heart. This was because no matter how many ants there were still ants in the end. Moreover, the alliance of these sects wasn't an iron plate. Moreover, even if they really lived and died together and advanced and retreated together, Xiao Chen didn't care because they were still no threat to the sword sect. They didn't even have the right to make Xiao Chen angry. As for the shrines, Xiao Chen could only say that they thought too simply. The new sect master of the shrines seemed to be called Shen Hui. Xiao Chen could guarantee that the shrines wouldn't care about the matters of the sword sect, especially at a time like this. Moreover, they didn't even know Shen Hui. They only knew a shrine's elder. To put it bluntly, could an elder make the decision? In Xiao Chen's opinion, The alliance of these factions was simply too laughable. Therefore, after hearing Tan Nong's words, Xiao Qin's gaze also looked in the direction of the courtyard door, and he smiled faintly. Tell me, are these fellows trying to make me laugh to death? Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2167. Following Xiao Qin's words, Song Xing's figure slowly walked in. At the same time, he had a faint smile on his face as he said, Sect leader is right, they're just a bunch of idiots. Song Xing's appearance caused Tian Nong, who was originally sitting opposite Xiao Qun, to hurriedly stand up and respectfully greet him. This lowly Tian Nong greets vice sect leader. Not only had Tian Nong seen Song Xing before, but he had also heard of Song Xing's great name. He had heard many things about Song Xing in the past. Among the vice sect leaders of the sword sect, no one could say for sure who was the strongest. After all, they had never truly fought before. However, if one were to say who had the most power, it would undoubtedly be Song Xing. Among the vice sect leaders of the sword sect, Song Xing was practically the #1 vice sect leader. Even Xiao Qin's senior brother, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan couldn't compare to Song Xing. This wasn't just because Song Xing had the most experience, but also because when Xiao Qun had just taken over the sword sect, Song Xing had given Xiao Qun unconditional support. Facing the #1 vice sect leader of the sword sect, Tian Nong was naturally nervous. Moreover, apart from the power in his hands, Song Xing was also a true End Realm expert. End Realm expert. To Tian Nong, this was something that he could only dream of. Facing Tian Nong's respect, Song Xing only smiled and didn't say anything. He directly walked in front of Xiao Qun and said calmly, What does sect leader plan to do? Song Xing asked Xiao Qun how he was going to deal with these people. Hearing this, Xiao Qun's smile did not fade as he said, Kill the chicken to warn the monkey. I'll leave this matter to you. Xiao Qun handed the matter over to Song Xing naturally. Such a small matter did not require Xiao Qun to deal with personally. Song Xing was enough. Upon hearing Xiao Qun's words, Song Xing smiled and nodded. Then, Xiao Qun continued, Tian Nong sounds good, you can arrange it. Since Tian Nong had taken the initiative to report this matter to him, Xiao Qun naturally wouldn't get rid of her after she had outlived her usefulness. He specifically asked Song Xing to arrange for Tian Nong to join the sword sect. Hearing that Xiao Qun had personally asked, Tian Nong was delighted. However, in front of Xiao Qun and Song Xing, she didn't dare to show it. She could only bury the joy in her heart. Many powers were working together to go against the sword sect. To Xiao Qun, there was naturally no need to hold back. Since they were asking to die, then why wouldn't Xiao Qun grant them their wish? As for killing the chicken to warn the monkey, that was the simplest method. Moreover, Xiao Qun had already decided on the target. It was the power that the peak Dao realm sect leader was in. Although this person was the strongest out of all the sect leaders, and even had the possibility of breaking through to the End Realm, the power he was in was also the strongest. If he could join, then the sword sect strength would increase. In the future, if this sect leader was able to break through to the End Realm, then it would be of great help to the sword sect. However, although this person wasn't bad, it was a pity that he couldn't use him. Thus, he could only give him up. Moreover, from this person's unruly personality, he wasn't someone who was willing to submit to others. Since he couldn't get him, then he could only destroy him. He gave the entire matter to Song Xing to handle. At this moment, the dozen powers still didn't know that a calamity was about to descend on their heads. At this moment, they were still dreaming that the shrines would help and that they would be able to occupy a place in the Sword Manor. They could even form an alliance, and with the help of the shrines, they could fight against the Sword Sect. Outside Tong City, in a mountain range not far away, there was a series of simple wooden houses. This was the temporary base of the Lingnan sect. This Lingnan sect was the strongest power out of all the powers. Its sect leader was the middle-aged man who was at the peak Dao realm. His name was Wu Qinfeng. At this moment, Wu Qinfeng was sitting in his courtyard. Beside him were the sect leaders of the other two powers. The two of them were looking at Wu Qinfeng with flattery. Sect Lord Wu, this time it's all thanks to you. In the future, the two of us will definitely follow the lead of Sect Lord Wu. The reason why the two of them were flattering Wu Qinfeng was that the shrine's elder had sent a letter back saying that he was willing to mobilize the power of the shrines to help Wu Qinfeng and the others fight against the sword sect. After receiving the reply from the shrines, Wu Qinfeng and the others were naturally more confident. After all, the shrines were one of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Their strength was even stronger than the heavenly sect. With the help of the shrines, the sword sect naturally had no reason to be afraid. With the support of the shrines and the alliance of more than 10 powers, Wu Qinfeng and the others could already see a bright future. Wu Qinfeng enjoyed the flattery of the two people very much. His eyes were filled with unconcealable pride, but his mouth still put on an act as he spoke. The two of you are exaggerating. All of this is due to the praise you have given me. In fact, as long as we are truly united, the sword sect won't be able to do anything to us. Wu Qinfeng pretended to be modest, but the two of them acted as if they didn't hear him at all and continued to flatter him. Sect Lord Wu is right. In fact, the two of us have a suggestion. We hope that Sect Lord Wu won't refuse. Oh, what is it? The two of you can speak freely. If I can help, I, Wu Qinfeng, will not refuse. Hearing this, Wu Qinfeng said with a heroic face. Seeing Wu Qinfeng's heroic face, the two of them hurriedly said, Sect Lord Wu, although we are united, there is no one who can lead everyone. In this way, we are like scattered sand. Therefore, the two of us sincerely ask Sect Lord Wu to be the leader of the alliance. That's right. Since more than 10 of us have formed an alliance, how can there be no leader? Among all of us, I think only Sect Lord Wu is qualified to be the leader of the alliance. More than 10 powers united together, and now they actually wanted to form an alliance and choose a leader. Hearing the two of them, Wu Qinfeng's eyes flashed with a touch of excitement. To be honest, Wu Qinfeng coveted the position of the alliance leader very much, but he didn't know how to ask. At this moment, the two of them took the initiative to propose this matter, which was exactly what Wu Qinfeng wanted. Although he wanted the position of the alliance leader very much, on the surface, Wu Qinfeng still pretended to decline. How can I, Wu Qinfeng, be worthy of the position of the alliance leader? I think it's better for the two of you to choose someone else. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2168. They wanted to set up an alliance, and Wu Qinfeng would become the alliance leader. It had to be said that these people really thought too highly of everything. They wanted to set up an alliance, and Wu Qinfeng would become the alliance leader. It had to be said that these people really thought too highly of everything. There was also this Wu Qinfeng. He clearly coveted the position of alliance chief, but on the surface, he pretended to be humble. It really made people feel that he was a hypocrite. However, if Wu Qinfeng was hypocritical, then the two sect leaders beside him were even more hypocritical. When they heard Wu Qinfeng's words, they smiled even more flatteringly. Sect Lord Wu, the position of alliance leader belongs to none other than you. Other than you, who else is qualified to be the alliance leader? The two of them strongly recommended Wu Qinfeng to take the position of alliance leader. Wu Qinfeng was practically bursting with joy. In the end, after some hypocritical pleasantries, Wu Qinfeng seemed to accept the position of alliance leader reluctantly. He even pretended to say that he had taken the position of alliance leader for everyone's sake and that he had never had any selfish motives. These were extremely hypocritical words, but the two sect leaders beside him nodded vigorously and praised him. Wu Qinfeng and the others were still daydreaming, thinking that the shrines would definitely help them. Meanwhile, in a place far away from the sword mansion, in a beautiful sea of flowers, this sea of flowers was the cave residence of the Lord of the Shrines, Shun Hui. At that moment, in a pavilion in the middle of the sea of flowers, Shun Hui was listening to a white-robed elder report something to him. It was not until the white-robed elder had finished speaking that Shun Hui revealed a faint smile and said, That's right. Help that motley crew deal with the sword sect? Oh, where's he now? Shenhui was obviously talking about the sword sect, and that Shenhui was talking about was obviously the shrine's elder who was in contact with Wu Qinfeng. After receiving Wu Qinfeng's message, this elder was prepared to immediately send people to the Sword Mansion to help Wu Qinfeng and the others deal with the sword sect. However, before he could do anything, he was discovered by the higher-ups of shrines. Immediately, the white-robed old man in front of him personally captured him and immediately reported the matter to Shenhui. This white-robed old man was a deputy head of shrines, an almighty with end-realm cultivation. At this moment, when faced with Shun Hui's question, the old man replied respectfully, "He is captured below. Do you want to see him? Let's see him. After all, I also want to see a person who can be so foolish. At the same time, I also want to know what exactly is going on in this fool's mind." Hearing this, Shun Hui chuckled softly. In Shun Hui's opinion, this elder was simply too foolish. He actually offended the sword sect for Wu Qinfeng and the rest of the motley crew. If this wasn't so foolish that it was adorable, then what was? The shrines did not fear the sword sect, but they would definitely not provoke the sword sect for no reason and create a great enemy for themselves for no reason. Under Shun Hui's summons, this elder whose cultivation had been sealed was quickly brought before him. When he saw Shun Hui and the white-robed old man, this elder immediately knelt down in horror. At the same time, he anxiously begged for mercy. "Forgive me, Temple Master. I have no other intentions. Everything I do is for the sake of the shrines." Normally, the number of times this elder had met Shun Hui could be counted on one hand. Moreover, every time he met Shun Hui, he would only glance at him from among the crowd. Now, he was personally summoned by Shun Hui. However, this elder was not the slightest bit happy about this. Instead, he was filled with horror, afraid that Shun Hui would punish him. Looking at this elder who was constantly begging for mercy, Shun Hui's expression remained unchanged. "All right, raise your head." Upon hearing Shun Hui's words, this elder raised his head in trepidation. At the same time, Shun Hui also asked, "Do you know Wu Qinfeng from Lingnan sect?" "Yes, Temple Master, I do know him. However, I am not familiar with him. I got to know him when I went out to train in my early years. Temple Master, please understand. I really have no intention of betraying the shrines." Hearing this elder replied nervously. After hearing this elder's reply, Shun Hui did not say much. Instead, he continued to ask, "If that is the case, why are you helping Wu Qinfeng?" This was the question that Shun Hui was most curious about. For the sake of a small Lingnan sect and a mere Wu Qinfeng, this elder was actually willing to provoke the sword sect. Shun Hui really did not know what he was thinking. However, this elder gave an answer very quickly. He replied cautiously, afraid of angering Shun Hui. "Temple Master, I was just thinking. Based on the current situation, the sword sect will probably be a great enemy in the future. If we can take this opportunity to deal a heavy blow to the sword sect, it will also be beneficial to the shrines." Want to deal a heavy blow to the sword sect? Hearing this, Shun Hui could not help but smile. He asked in amusement, "Do you really think that Wu Qinfeng and his group can deal a heavy blow to the sword sect?" "Temple Master, Wu Qinfeng and his group of more than a dozen sects have joined forces. They're not weak. What I am thinking is that with my support, even if we can't deal a heavy blow to the sword sect, we can at least tire the sword sect out. In the long run, this will be beneficial to the shrines. If Wu Qinfeng and his group of more than a dozen sects join forces, they will be able to contend against the sword sect." After hearing this elder's reply, Shun Hui immediately laughed out loud. The elder had no idea what Shun Hui was thinking. Seeing this, he quickly lowered his head and knelt on the ground. After a while, Shun Hui's laughter slowly died down. Then, he looked at the elder who was kneeling on the ground mockingly. "Why do you think the sword sect is now on equal footing with us, the 10 great Lingtian sects? Why do you think even the Katian sect has always been wary of the sword sect and wants to destroy the sword sect? but they have failed time and time again. Do you think that Wu Qinfeng and his motley crew can really contend against the sword sect? Shen Hui asked 3 questions in a row. Hearing this, the elder became more and more nervous. In the end, he was practically prostrating himself on the ground. With a look of horror, he said, "I know my mistake. Please punish me, Lord Temple." "Do you really know your mistake?" Shen Hui asked with a smile on his face. He knew that this elder was loyal to the shrines and was extremely loyal. The reason he did what he did this time was completely for the sake of the shrines. However, although he had good intentions, his intelligence was indeed worrying. In other words, he had underestimated the sword sect. Just think about the attitude of the 10 great Ling Tian sects towards the sword sect. If the sword sect was really in existence that Wu Qinfeng and his motley crew could contend against, then why would the 10 great Ling Tian sects be so wary of the sword sect? How could the sword sect be on equal footing with the 10 great Ling Tian sects? Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2169. Faced with Shun Hui's question, the elder did not dare to speak again. He was afraid that if he said something wrong, he would provoke Shun Hui's anger. Seeing that the elder had fallen silent, Shun Hui did not show any signs of getting angry. After asking 3 questions in a row, Shun Hui continued, "Although the shrines do not fear the sword sect, we cannot create a strong enemy for ourselves for no reason. If you think that Wu Qinfeng's motley crew can contend with the sword sect, I can tell you right now that it is merely a daydream. Even if 20 or 30 sects joined forces, they would be nothing more than a motley crew to the sword sect, let alone a dozen sects joining forces. You think that by doing this, you can create some trouble for the sword sect. However, let me tell you this. Not only will your actions not cause any trouble for the sword sect, but you will also create a strong enemy for the shrines. If you want to contend with the sword sect, even the shrines will have to go all out. As such, do you still think that Wu Qinfeng's motley crew can contend with the sword sect?" Upon hearing Shun Hui's words, the elder nodded respectfully and replied, "I know my mistake. All right, on account of your unwavering loyalty to the shrines, I will forgive you this time. Go to the Valley of the Gods and reflect on your mistakes behind closed doors. You are not allowed to leave for a year," Shun Hui said with a wave of his hand. He did not punish the elder severely. After all, Shun Hui could feel his loyalty to the shrines. Even if such a person had made some mistakes, as long as they were not too serious, Shun Hui would not be too harsh on him. Furthermore, this time, the matter had not caused any losses to the shrines because the white-robed elder had stopped it in time. As such, there was naturally no need to be too harsh on him. After ordering the elder to leave, Shun Hui turned to look at the white-robed elder beside him. The smile on his face did not disappear. There are always some people in this world who are willing to daydream. Haha. In Shun Hui's opinion, the actions of Wu Qinfeng and the rest were undoubtedly courting death. They thought that by joining forces, they would be able to contend with the sword sect. Did they not look at the current situation in the Great Thousand World? Apart from the Sword Mansion, the chaos in the other prefectures was quickly suppressed with the help of the 10 Ling Tian sects. In the face of the 10 great Ling Tian sects, even if the ordinary forces were to join forces, they would not be able to contend against them. What a joke! Wu Qinfeng and the others actually did not realize this point. Or did they think that just because Sword Sect was not one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects, they would be able to contend against them? However, although the Sword Sect was not yet one of the 10 Ling Tian sects, it already had the strength of one of the 10 Ling Tian sects. This was because all of the Ling Tian sects had to be cautious when facing the Sword Sect. This was also the reason why the Sword Sect was able to split the Heavenly Mansion into 2 and form an independent Sword Mansion in the hands of the Heavenly Sect. However, the Heavenly Sect still remained silent. Wu Qinfeng and the rest had thought too simply of the Sword Sect and Xiao Chun. As soon as he finished speaking, Shun Hui stood up with his hands behind his back. He walked unhurriedly toward the periphery of the Sea of Flowers. As he walked, He muttered to himself. How could someone who could pull the sword sect back from the edge of the cliff and even bring it to its current height be simple? Xiao Chun, it seems like it's time for you to draw your sword. Shen Hui was certain that there would not be any changes in the sword mansion. Unless the Tenling Tian sects made a move, no one would be able to change the current situation of the sword mansion. They would not even be able to cause a ripple. Since Shen Hui had stopped the shrines, this meant that Wu Qinfeng and the rest would no longer be able to get any help from the shrines. Unfortunately, Wu Qinfeng and the rest were still in the dark and did not know about this at all. At this moment, outside Tong City, Wu Qinfeng and the rest were still dreaming. They had even decided to hold the grand ceremony for the establishment of the alliance 2 days later. At the same time, Wu Qinfeng would become the alliance leader of the alliance. What was even more ridiculous was that Wu Qinfeng and the rest had even given their alliance a name, the Sword Reverse Alliance. The meaning of the Sword Reverse Alliance was obvious. They were going against the Sword Sect. They had no intention of hiding the news at all. Therefore, the establishment of the Sword Reverse Alliance quickly spread around Tong City. In the back garden of the city governor's estate, Xiao Chun, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan were sitting together. At this moment, Xiao Chun was rocking back and forth with laughter. Haha, the Sword Reverse Alliance. Interesting. After hearing about the Sword Reverse Alliance, Xiao Chen's first reaction was not anger, but amusement. This was because in Xiao Chen's opinion, this so-called Sword Reverse Alliance was like a child's play. Xiao Chun did not get angry at the establishment of the Sword Reverse Alliance. Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan, who were beside him, also could not help but laugh. Thinking about it, if a mere Sword Reverse Alliance was enough to contend against the Sword Sect, then the Sword Sect would have been annihilated hundreds of times already. After laughing, Xiao Chun looked at Nangong Guan and the others and said, "Senior apprentice brother, isn't this what people always say? If you want to destroy something, you must first make it crazy." Wu Qinfeng and the rest were indeed crazy. It could even be said that they were openly challenging the authority of the Sword Sect. The establishment of the Sword Reverse Alliance was not concealed in the slightest. In fact, Wu Qinfeng and the rest had even spread the news with great fanfare and invited everyone to attend the Sword Reverse Alliance's establishment ceremony. After hearing Xiao Chen's words, Nangong Guan took a sip of wine and said indifferently, "Perhaps we were too easygoing before, so these guys overlooked something. In the past, when the Sword Sect had dealt with these foreign forces and cultivators, they had indeed been very peaceful and had never suppressed them. It was because of this that Wu Qinfeng and the rest had overlooked the Sword Sect's strength. It could even be said that they felt that the Sword Sect was too cowardly." Hearing Nangong Guan's words, Xiao Chen's smile didn't fade, but a cold light flashed in his eyes as he said, "Then let's have Song Xing remind them and wake them up." Xiao Chun had already handed over the matter of Wu Qinfeng and the others to Song Xing, so Xiao Chun had no intention of interfering. Hearing this, Zhou Song spoke up. "Junior apprentice brother, are you leaving everything to Song Xing? We don't need to do anything." "No need. If we had to send out 4 vice sect masters to deal with a bunch of mobs, wouldn't that make us a laughingstock? Song Xing alone is enough. In fact, I think that Song Xing might not even personally appear because Wu Qinfeng and the others aren't qualified enough for the Sword Sect's vice sect masters to take action." Xiao Chun replied with a relaxed expression. "Please add this to your collection, monthly votes and recommendations." In a chapter, Chapter 2170. There was no way that Xiao Chun would personally deal with a bunch of clowns like Wu Qinfeng. After all, as the sect leader of the Sword Sect, if he needed Xiao Chun to personally deal with a mere Wu Qinfeng, wouldn't that be telling the world that the Sword Sect had no capable people? There was no way that Xiao Chun would personally deal with a bunch of clowns like Wu Qinfeng. After all, as the sect leader of the Sword Sect, if he needed Xiao Chun to personally deal with a mere Sword Sect like Wu Qinfeng, wouldn't that be telling the world that the Sword Sect had no capable people? Therefore, Xiao Chun wouldn't care about this matter. Moreover, according to Xiao Chen's guess, even Song Xing wouldn't personally deal with this matter, because Wu Qinfeng and the others weren't worthy. While Xiao Chun and the others were chatting, on the other side, in Song Xing's residence, an elder of the sword sect strode into the room and respectfully bowed to Song Xing, reporting to the vice sect leader. In 2 days, the Sword Defiance Alliance will be holding an establishment ceremony outside Tong City. The Sword Defiance Alliance. When Song Xing heard the elder's words, his expression didn't change at all. He simply said indifferently, Sword Defiance Alliance, ha. With a cold laugh, Song Xing waved his hand, indicating for the elder to leave. Then he took out a sound transmission talisman and sent a message back to the sword sect. At such a crucial time, Song Xing actually sent a message back to the sword sect. The person he sent this message to was the most senior sword head in the sword sect, Zhao Yu. As the most senior sword head in the sword sect, Zhao Yu's cultivation had long reached the great circle of the Dao realm. As long as he could break through to the end realm, he would definitely become the vice sect leader. In the sword sect, Zhao Yu was cultivating with Qianling when he suddenly received Song Xing's message. A golden light entered his forehead, and a moment later, Zhao Yu opened his eyes. Seeing Zhao Yu come back to his senses, Qianling asked curiously, "Who is it?" Vice Sect Master Song Xing. Hearing this, Zhao Yu replied truthfully, Vice Sect Leader, Song Xing? What's the matter?" Qianling was even more curious. In response to Qianling's question, Zhao Yu told him the contents of Song Xing's message. Actually, the content of Song Xing's message was very simple. It was just a simple order. Song Xing ordered Zhao Yu to be in charge of the Sword Reverse Alliance and to rush to Tong City within 2 days. Before the Sword Reverse Alliance's establishment ceremony, they would uproot the Sword Reverse Alliance. In short, Song Xing didn't want to see any Sword Reverse Alliance in the Great Thousand World. As for what to do, Zhao Yu could decide. Hearing about the Sword Reverse Alliance, Qianling was first stunned, but then he laughed coldly. Sword Reverse Alliance. What kind of Tom, Dick, and Harry dares to provoke my sword sect? I'll go with you. Qianling took the initiative to say that he wanted to go with Zhao Yu to Tong City. Although Qianling didn't know much about the Sword Reverse Alliance, since they dared to name themselves after the Sword Reverse Alliance, only death awaited them. Zhao Yu didn't reject Qianling's offer. Moreover, Zhao Yu didn't plan to just let the two of them go. Song Xing's intention was very simple. This time, the Sword Reverse Alliance was courting death, so they just had to destroy it. However, destroying the Sword Reverse Alliance was a small matter for the Sword Sect. What Song Xing really wanted to see was to use the Sword Reverse Alliance's incident as an example to others. Otherwise, no Tom, Dick, and Harry would dare to provoke the Sword Sect in the future. To put it bluntly, he wanted to use the Sword Reverse Alliance as an example. Therefore, after receiving Song Xing's order, Zhao Yu and Qianling immediately paid a visit to the other sword chiefs. In the end, under Zhao Yu's invitation, a total of 10 sword chiefs with Dao Realm cultivation led hundreds of elders with Dao Realm cultivation to Tong City. As the sword sect continued to grow in strength, there were now more than 30 sword chiefs in the sword sect. In other words, there were more than 30 Dao Realm experts in the sword sect. Although there weren't many people, only a little over 100 in total, the weakest of them was in the Dao Realm. There were even 10 sword chiefs with Dao Realm cultivation. Zhao Yu clearly understood Song Xing's intentions. The departure of Zhao Yu and the others didn't alarm too many people. After sending a message to Zhao Yu, Song Xing didn't care about the Sword Reverse Alliance anymore. However, one night before the Sword Reverse Alliance's so-called grand ceremony, Tian Nong actually took the initiative to ask to see Song Xing. It was already late at night, and the Sword Reverse Alliance's so-called grand ceremony was tomorrow. Tian Nong asked to see Song Xing. Hearing this, Song Xing, who was cultivating in the courtyard, calmly said, "Let him in." With Song Xing's permission, Tian Nong was led into the courtyard by a deacon of the sword sect. From afar, he saw Song Xing sitting cross-legged in the courtyard, cultivating in the pavilion. Seeing that Song Xing was cultivating, Tian Nong didn't dare to disturb him and could only wait patiently. Since Song Xing didn't summon him, Tian Nong naturally didn't dare to interrupt Song Xing's cultivation. After 2 hours, Song Xing slowly opened his eyes and looked at Tian Nong, who had been waiting for a long time. Tian Nong, why did you ask to see me so late at night? Vice Sect Master, tomorrow is the grand ceremony of the Sword Reverse Alliance. This lowly one is here because Tian Nong originally came to see that Song Xing hadn't done anything. Since tomorrow was the grand ceremony of the Sword Reverse Alliance, Tian Nong was worried, so he came early. After all, this was the best opportunity for Tian Nong to perform meritorious deeds after joining the Sword Sect. Tian Nong didn't want to mess it up, nor did he want to disappoint Xiao Chun. He saw that Tian Nong had come here because he was worried about what would happen the next day. In fact, Tian Nong's worries weren't unfounded. After all, if the grand ceremony of the Sword Reverse Alliance was allowed to proceed smoothly, it would be a great humiliation for the Sword Sect. He believed that Xiao Chun wouldn't want to see such an outcome. Therefore, they had to destroy this so-called Sword Reverse Alliance before tomorrow's grand ceremony. However, Tian Nong clearly didn't understand the strength of the Sword Sect, so before he could finish, Song Xing interrupted him. What? Do you think I need to personally deal with a mere Sword Reverse Alliance? As an End Realm expert who held great power, Song Xing was naturally a very arrogant person. Facing a mere Sword Reverse Alliance, Song Xing had never thought of personally dealing with it. In his opinion, Wu Qinfeng's group wasn't worthy. Hearing Song Xing's words, Tian Nong hurriedly cupped his hands and replied, "This lowly one wouldn't dare. This lowly one didn't mean that. Please forgive me, Vice Sect Master. All right, you don't have to worry about the Sword Reverse Alliance. The day of the grand ceremony will be the day they are destroyed." Song Xing waved his hand and said. Seeing this, Tian Nong naturally couldn't say anything more. He could only cup his hands and bow, then prepare to leave. However, just as Tian Nong was about to leave the courtyard, Song Xing's voice slowly sounded from behind him. "Since you've already joined the Sword Sect, how can you be so petty? A mere Sword Reverse Alliance is enough to make you so worried. Tian Nong, you have to remember that the Sword Sect's opponents are only the 10 Great Lingtian sects. Apart from the 10 Great Lingtian sects, the other factions aren't qualified to go against the Sword Sect. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. Chapter 2171. In Song Xing's eyes, the so-called Sword Defiance Alliance was nothing more than a joke. It was not worth his attention at all. Therefore, after handing the matter of the Sword Defiance Alliance to Zhao Yu, Song Xing no longer asked about it. Tian Nong, who was about to leave, suddenly heard Song Xing's words. He immediately turned around and bowed respectfully. Tian Nong will remember Vice Sect Master's words. After hearing Song Xing's words, Tian Nong was suddenly enlightened. At the same time, he realized that he had been making a big fuss over nothing. With the strength of the Sword Sect, how could the Sword Defiance Alliance that Wu Qinfeng had casually formed be enough to shake it? Didn't he choose to join the Sword Sect because of the strength of the Sword Sect? For a moment, Tian Nong was full of confidence in the Sword Sect. The last bit of worry in his heart had completely disappeared. After Tian Nong left, Song Xing closed his eyes and continued to cultivate. As for the matter of the Sword Defiance Alliance, Song Xing was not worried at all. Even if the Sword Defiance Alliance's founding ceremony was tomorrow, would they be able to successfully hold it? The night quickly passed. The next morning, in the temporary encampment of the Lingnan sect outside of Tong City, the location of the Sword Defiance Alliance's founding ceremony. Early in the morning, the disciples of the Southern Ridge sect and the other sects began to get busy, especially the disciples of the Southern Ridge sect, because Wu Qinfeng was about to become the leader of the Sword Defiance Alliance. Many of the Southern Ridge sect disciples were extremely excited, and unconcealable smiles hung on their faces. With Wu Qinfeng becoming the alliance master of the Sword Defiance Alliance, the Lingnan sect would naturally become the leader of the Sword Defiance Alliance. However, These disciples of the Lingnan sect were only thinking about the glory of the future. They did not think that a calamity was about to befall them. As time passed, more and more experts from the Sword Defiance Alliance showed up. Although the Alliance had invited some rogue cultivators, none of them had shown up. The local forces of the Sword Mansion would definitely not participate in the Sword Defiance Alliance's grand ceremony. In fact, if it wasn't for the Sword Sect, they would have already come knocking on his door. As for the few rogue cultivators who had received the invitation, they had also gathered in Tong City. Among them, the Dao Realm expert who represented the rogue cultivators to meet Xiao Chun was sitting on the main seat. This person's name was Wang Wu, and he was the well-deserved #1 expert amongst all the loose cultivators that had come from outside. Of course, Wang Wu had already joined the Sword Sect, but he hadn't announced it to the public yet. At this moment, many of the rogue cultivators had gathered together. Many of them looked at Wang Wu and asked, "Senior Wang Wu, are we really not going to attend the Sword Defiance Alliance's grand ceremony?" "What for? It's an alliance that's about to be destroyed. Are we going to die with them?" Wang Wu calmly replied. Hearing Wang Wu's words, the rogue cultivators present were stunned. Then, someone couldn't help but ask, "Senior Wang Wu, is the Sword Sect really going to destroy the Sword Defiance Alliance?" The Sword Defiance Alliance is not weak. It's an alliance formed by more than 10 forces. Their strength cannot be underestimated. Wang Wu couldn't help but shake his head and smile bitterly. These people only saw that the Sword Defiance Alliance was formed by more than 10 forces, but they didn't see that these forces were like ants in front of the Sword Sect. To put it bluntly, if more than 10 ants worked together, wouldn't they still be ants? These people overestimated the Sword Defiance Alliance and underestimated the Sword Sect's strength. Of course, they couldn't be blamed. After all, with their current strength, it was very difficult for them to come into contact with powerful sects like the Sword Sect. As such, it wasn't strange that the ignorant were fearless. Wang Wu chuckled inwardly as he said, "Everyone just wait and see. The Sword Defiance Alliance won't be able to survive this day." Wang Wu was certain that the Sword Defiance Alliance would be destroyed today. There was no chance of it being established. This so-called grand ceremony was nothing more than a joke. Seeing that Wang Wu was so confident, everyone present nodded one after another. With Wang Wu's prestige among many rogue cultivators basically believed what he said. Because of Wang Wu's presence, none of the rogue cultivators who had received the Sword Defiance Alliance's invitation went to the grand ceremony. This was because Wang Wu had already told them beforehand that if any of them were to attend this so-called grand ceremony, they would be responsible for anything that happened. If they wanted to accompany the Sword Defiance Alliance to the grave, Wang Wu would not stop them. Because of this, no one dared to go. However, everyone was waiting for the Sword Sect's reaction. They wanted to see if the Sword Sect was as powerful as Wang Wu had said. Many rogue cultivators gathered together, drinking and chatting as they waited for the outcome. Do you guys think that the Sword Sect's sect master, Xiao Chun, will personally take action? I don't think so. After all, it would be embarrassing for the sect master to personally take action against the Sword Defiance Alliance. I think so too. However, even if sect master Xiao Chun doesn't personally take action, the Sword Sect's vice sect masters will definitely take action. Yes, I also think that the Sword Sect's vice sect masters will personally take action. However, I don't know how many vice sect masters will take action. I think there will be at least 2. After all, the Sword Defiance Alliance isn't weak. Everyone gathered together, drinking and chatting. In their opinion, at least 2 vice sect masters from the Sword Sect would personally take action to destroy the Sword Defiance Alliance. Hearing these people's words, Wang Wu didn't say anything. However, there was a trace of smile on his face. Occasionally, he would even nod his head. In Wang Wu's opinion, these little fellows were too naive. Naturally, Xiao Chun wouldn't personally take action to destroy the Sword Defiance Alliance. Not only would Xiao Chun not take action, Wang Wu believed that even vice sect masters like Song Xing wouldn't take action. According to Wang Wu's guess, this time, only the head of the Sword Defiance Alliance would take action. the Sword Defiance Alliance would probably be destroyed before even seeing a vice sect master. To put it bluntly, in the eyes of Wang Wu and the other local forces of the Sword Mansion, the Sword Defiance Alliance was just a bunch of clowns who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Just as everyone was waiting for the outcome, outside of Tong City, the Sword Defiance Alliance's grand ceremony finally began. Wu Qinfeng and the other sect masters of more than 10 sects appeared one after another, begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. In a chapter, Chapter 2172, Wu Qinfeng and the other sect masters appeared one after another. However, other than them, none of the other independent cultivators who received the invitation came. Wu Qinfeng and the other sect masters appeared one after another. However, other than them, none of the other independent cultivators who received the invitation came. After knowing the result, Wu Qinfeng's face was obviously gloomy. He snorted and said, "Humph. It must be Wang Wu, a cowardly rat." Wu Qinfeng immediately guessed that it was Wang Wu who stopped them. That was why no one came. However, Wu Qinfeng's guess was not accurate. Wang Wu did persuade them, but in fact, he did not stop anyone. Those independent cultivators who received the invitation did not come because they were afraid of the Sword Sect. He was a little unhappy. After all, there were no guests. Wouldn't this so-called ceremony be like a show for himself? However, Wu Qinfeng could no longer turn back. He could only brace himself and continue with the ceremony. In addition, Wu Qinfeng was actually worried about the shrines. Originally, Wu Qinfeng planned to invite the shrine's experts to participate in the ceremony. However, after a few days, Wu Qinfeng could not contact the shrine's elder. This made Wu Qinfeng feel a little uncertain. After all, the shrines were the real source of Wu Qinfeng's confidence in fighting against the Sword Sect. However, now, the shrine's experts did not appear. This made Wu Qinfeng a little anxious. There was a trace of doubt and apprehension in his heart. However, as time passed, Wu Qinfeng finally braced himself and announced the start of the ceremony. Wu Qinfeng and the other sect masters sat on a high platform built from ancient trees. As the Alliance Master, Wu Qinfeng naturally sat on the main seat. He nodded slightly to a Lingnan sect elder beside him. Seeing this, the elder shouted, "Everyone, the Sword Defiance Alliance's founding ceremony will now begin." He loudly announced the start of the grand ceremony. However, just as this elder's voice sounded, an extremely untimely sneer was transmitted from the sky. Sword Defiance Alliance? What a joke. It's just a bunch of mobs. His voice was filled with disdain. Hearing this, Wu Qinfeng immediately stood up and shouted angrily at the empty sky. "Who is it? Get the hell out here." As the Alliance Master, Wu Qinfeng naturally could not lose face during the Sword Defiance Alliance's grand ceremony. As such, he spoke in an extremely domineering manner. As soon as he finished speaking, dozens of cracks of various sizes appeared in the sky. Moreover, people wearing the robes of the Sword Sect's elders strode out from the cracks. Leading them were 10 Sword Sect elders. Over 100 experts from the Sword Sect descended together. Seeing this, Wu Qinfeng's eyes flashed with a trace of seriousness. Although he had already guessed that this would happen, when he actually faced the Sword Sect, Wu Qinfeng could not help but feel a trace of fear. Although he knew that these people were experts from the Sword Sect, Wu Qinfeng still deliberately asked, "Who else are you?" "Ha! Wu Qinfeng, stop putting on an act here. How could you not know our identity?" Hearing this, the leader, Zhao Yu, immediately sneered and replied. Hearing this, Wu Qinfeng shouted with a gloomy expression, "Hell, what? Sect Master Xiao Chun did not show himself and let you come? You think you're qualified to talk to our Sect Master?" Zhao Yu's eyes flashed with killing intent. In Zhao Yu's opinion, a nobody like Wu Qinfeng was not qualified to mention Xiao Chen's name. It was as if wanting to meet Xiao Chen was simply a pipe dream. The killing intent in his eyes continued to condense. Not only Zhao Yu, but Qian Ling and the other sword heads of the Sword Sect were also the same. Feeling the dense killing intent from Zhao Yu, Wu Qinfeng's fear grew deeper and deeper. At the same time, Wu Qinfeng also felt the cultivation realm of Zhao Yu and the others. More than 100 experts had arrived. The lowest cultivation realm was in the enlightenment realm, while the 10 sword heads, including Zhao Yu, were all in the Dao realm. More than half of them were in the Dao realm perfection stage. 10 Dao realm super experts and more than 100 enlightenment realm experts. Such strength made Wu Qinfeng feel a sense of powerlessness. In fact, from the beginning, Wu Qinfeng knew that the sword sect was not weak. There was no way he and the others could fight against the sword sect. Therefore, Wu Qinfeng's trump card all along could be said to be the shrines. Unfortunately, there was still no news from the shrines. The reinforcements that were supposed to come were also nowhere to be seen. The experts from the shrines did not appear. Instead, the people from the sword sect arrived. Looking at the aggressive Zhao Yu and the others, Wu Qinfeng suppressed the nervousness in his heart and said, "I want to see sect leader Xiao Chun. There must be some misunderstanding between us and the sword sect." Wu Qinfeng kept insisting that he wanted to see Xiao Chun. Little did he know that his attitude only made the killing intent in the hearts of Zhao Yu and the others even stronger. Zhao Yu snorted coldly and said with overflowing killing intent, "This old man has already said that you are not qualified to see the sect master. Kill him." Zhao Yu naturally would not hold back against Wu Qinfeng and the so-called Sword Defiance Alliance. Moreover, the order that Song Xing gave Zhao Yu was very simple, and that was to destroy the Sword Defiance Alliance. Following Zhao Yu's cold shout, the group of Swords Gate experts attacked one after another. When he saw this, the corners of Wu Qinfeng's eyes could not help but twitch. Unfortunately, he did not have much time to think, as Zhao Yu had already taken the initiative to attack. Before the Sword Defiance Alliance's so-called grand ceremony officially began, the expert from the sword sect had already descended from the sky. For a moment, the two sides naturally clashed. However, in the face of the sword sect strength, although the Heaven-Defying Alliance had a lot more people, it was still useless. After all, the cultivation bases of the disciples of the Sword Reverse Alliance were too low. There were very few immortal emperors among them. In front of the experts of Swords Gate, they were as weak as ants. There was no way they could do anything to the Sword Reverse Alliance. Outside Tong City, the battle between the Sword Defiance Alliance and the Sword Sect had already begun. Meanwhile, in Tong City, the various major forces, including the many rogue cultivators, had also received the news. When they heard that the experts from the Sword Sect had arrived, the local forces of the Sword Sect were not surprised. After all, they had a deep understanding of the Sword Sect and the strength of the Sword Sect. However, many of the rogue cultivators who came from the outside could not remain calm. When they heard that the Sword Gate had actually sent out 10 Sword Head Elders and over 100 ordinary elders who had reached the comprehension stage, many of the loose cultivators were stunned. There were even some who unconsciously opened their mouths and muttered. 10 Dao Realm experts and more than 100 Enlightenment Realm experts. The strength of the Sword Sect. Please add this to your collection. Please recommend me. End of chapter. Chapter 2173. The fact that the Sword Sect had sent out so many experts at once was beyond the expectations of these rogue cultivators. After all, Dao Realm experts were already top-notch figures in their eyes. In the Sword Reverse Alliance, aside from Wu Qinfeng, there were only 2 other Dao Realm experts. As for the rogue cultivators, including Wang Wu, there were only 3 Dao Realm experts. However, the Sword Sect had actually sent out 10 Dao Realm experts at once. Everyone looked at Wang Wu in shock. Some of them couldn't help but ask, "Senior Wang Wu, does this mean that the Sword Sect didn't send out a single Vice Sect Master?" Judging from the current situation, Swords Gate didn't even have a single Vice Headmaster. They were all led by the Dao Realm Elders of Swords Gate. Originally, everyone thought that even if the Sword Sect wanted to destroy the Sword Reverse Alliance, they would need at least 1 or 2 Vice Sect Masters. However, it seemed that they were completely wrong. The vice sect masters of the sword sect didn't even look at the sword reverse alliance in the eye. They didn't even put the sword reverse alliance in their eyes. Hearing these people's shocked questions, Wang Mu smiled and said, "That's why I said that you guys think too highly of the Sword Defiance Alliance. It's just a motley crew. How could the vice sect lords personally act? The vice sect masters wouldn't personally take action against the Sword Reverse Alliance. This was because even if they won, the Sword Reverse Alliance would be degrading. Secondly, the Sword Sect didn't put the Sword Reverse Alliance in their eyes at all." Following Wang Wu's words, everyone fell silent. At the same time, their fear of the Sword Sect rose exponentially. At the same time, outside of Tong City, at the Lingnan sect's encampment, the battle had completely broken out. However, in the face of the many experts of the Sword Sect, the disciples of the Sword Reverse Alliance were slaughtered like vegetables. There was a huge disparity in numbers, but there was also a huge disparity in strength. It must be known that among the 10 or so sects in the Sword Defiance Alliance, most of them only had Comprehension Realm experts as their strongest. As for the Sword Sect side, the weakest of the 100 or so people who had descended this time was in the Enlightenment Realm, let alone Zhao Yu and the other 3 Dao Realm experts. They were simply existences that could destroy the world. It was almost a one-sided massacre. At this moment, Wu Qinfeng, who was fighting fiercely with Zhao Yu, finally woke up and realized how foolish and ignorant everything he had done before was. They actually dared to think that they could contend against the Sword Sect with the alliance of more than 10 sections. This was simply wishful thinking. At this moment, Wu Qinfeng finally understood why the Sword Sect hadn't said anything when they had formed the Reverse Sword Alliance. It wasn't because the Sword Sect was afraid, nor was it because the Sword Sect was afraid of them. It was because they didn't care about the Sword Defiance Alliance at all. At this moment, groups of Sword Defiance Alliance disciples were being slaughtered by the Sword Sect's experts. Blood had long dyed the ground red, and screams and pleas for mercy were endless. The Sword Sect's Sect Master and Vice Sect Master didn't even show up. Just these people alone were enough to completely defeat the Sword Defiance Alliance. Not only Wu Qinfeng, but the other sect masters also realized this point. At the same time, they personally experienced the terror of the Sword Sect. It was fine if they didn't make a move, but once they did, they left no room for a comeback. The unparalleled Tang sect foe at this moment, Wu Qinfeng and the other sect masters finally realized why the Sword Sect could stand on equal footing with the 10 great Ling Tian sects, why they could contend against the Heavenly Sect, and why the Heavenly Sect couldn't do anything to the Sword Sect. It was because the Sword Sect did indeed have such strength. It turned out that they had been provoking a powerful force that could contend with the 10 great Ling Tian sects. They couldn't fight them head-on. When he thought of this, Wu Qinfeng retreated as he fought, looking for an opportunity to escape. As for what Wu Qinfeng was thinking, Zhao Yu immediately guessed it. He sneered and said, "Don't you think you're too naive to think that you can escape now?" As he spoke, Zhao Yu's attacks became even more violent. He held Wu Qinfeng back tightly, not giving Wu Qinfeng any chance to escape. Wu Qinfeng couldn't escape at all as he was held back by Zhao Yu. On the other hand, the other sect masters were not as strong as Wu Qinfeng. At this moment, more than half of them had been killed by the Sword Sect's powerhouses. Meanwhile, a sect master who also had a Dao realm cultivation base like Wu Qinfeng was fighting fiercely with Qianling. However, his cultivation base was only at the Mastery Dao realm, so he was naturally no match for Qianling. After a short few dozen moves, the sect master was completely at a disadvantage. At the same time, he also suffered quite a few injuries. He held on bitterly, but at the same time, he was filled with regret. At this moment, the sect master looked at Qianling and begged for mercy. "I surrender. I'm willing to surrender. I'm willing to pledge allegiance to the Sword Sect." At this point, the sect master expressed his willingness to pledge allegiance to the Sword Sect. However, Qianling didn't hesitate and coldly rejected him. It's too late now. Xiao Chun had given them a chance to choose and gave them enough time to think. However, The answer they gave wasn't to pledge allegiance. Instead, they disobeyed Xiao Qin's orders and even wanted to join forces to fight against the Sword Sect. The Sword Sect naturally wouldn't accept these people. Qianling knew this very well. Without giving the sect master a chance to beg for mercy, Qianling stabbed out with his sword. Then, a gust of wind that was as sharp as blades transformed into numerous blades that instantly enveloped the sect master. Enveloped by the gust of wind blades, the sect master desperately resisted. However, his defense was quickly torn apart inch by inch. Then, deep wounds appeared on his body. In the end, the sect master was directly torn into pieces by the gust of wind blades. After successfully killing the sect master, Qianling looked at Zhao Yu, who was still fighting fiercely with Wu Qinfeng. In the Sword Reverse Alliance, Wu Qinfeng was undoubtedly the strongest. Therefore, he was still fighting fiercely with Zhao Yu. Seeing this scene, Qianling revealed a faint smile and said, "Zhao Yu, can you do it? If you can't, then let's have someone else." On the battlefield, Qianling still had the time to joke. However, when Zhao Yu heard his words, he shouted with a displeased expression, "Go away." Zhao Yu didn't need Qianling's help at all. Although Wu Qinfeng was also a complete Dao realm warrior, there was still a gap between their combat strengths in the same realm. Moreover, Zhao Yu was the sword elder of the Sword Sect. The various cultivation resources that he usually enjoyed were the best in the Great Thousand World. Naturally, Wu Qinfeng couldn't be compared to him. Chapter 2174. Wu Qinfeng was infuriated that Zhao Yu was still in the mood to tease Qianling in the midst of a fierce battle. However, Wu Qinfeng wasn't a fool. Judging from the current situation, Wu Qinfeng knew very well that he would die if he stayed. Wu Qinfeng was infuriated that Zhao Yu was still in the mood to tease Qianling in the midst of a fierce battle. However, Wu Qinfeng wasn't a fool either. Wu Qinfeng knew very well that he would die if he stayed. Apart from Zhao Yu, almost all of the 10 sword leaders of the Sword Sect had ended their battles. Facing 4 Dao realm experts at the same time, even if Wu Qinfeng lost his mind, he wouldn't think that he had any chance of winning. Therefore, while Zhao Yu and Qianling were teasing each other, Wu Qinfeng didn't hesitate to turn around and flee. Seeing that Wu Qinfeng had chosen to escape, Zhao Yu did not panic at all. Instead, a faint smile appeared on his face as he said, "Didn't this old man say that trying to escape now is too laughable?" Zhao Yu didn't seem to make any movements, but his entire body seemed to distort and gradually dissipated on the spot. Zhao Yu's body disappeared into thin air. He did not tear the void apart, nor did he use any movement martial skill. This method of Zhao Yu's was indeed extremely strange. As Qianling watched Zhao Yu disappear into the distance, he revealed a smile and said, "That idiot. He actually thought of escaping from Zhao Yu's hands." Qianling seemed to be very confident in Zhao Yu and didn't think that Wu Qinfeng could escape from him. The truth was indeed so. Although Wu Qinfeng was extremely sharp and had grasped the opportunity to flee far away in a flash, before he had the time to rejoice, a figure suddenly appeared in front of him. When he focused his eyes, it was actually Zhao Yu. Zhao Yu had obviously arrived here first, waiting for Wu Qinfeng's arrival. Seeing that Zhao Yu had actually blocked his path, Wu Qinfeng's expression changed greatly, and he said with a face of disbelief, "How is this possible? You?" Wu Qinfeng couldn't believe that Zhao Yu would appear in front of him first. His eyes were filled with fear. At the same time, Zhao Yu said lightly, "Why are you surprised? Actually, it's nothing much. This old man is the second person in the Sword Sect to comprehend the law of space after the ancestor. Therefore, catching up to you is as easy as flipping my hand." The law of space? Hearing Zhao Yu's words, Wu Qinfeng immediately lost his temper. At the same time, he knew very well that there was no chance for him to escape alive today. In front of Zhao Yu, who had comprehended the laws of space, Wu Qinfeng had no chance of escaping. Who would have thought that Zhao Yu would be able to comprehend the law of space? In the entire Sword Sect, apart from the ancestor Jun Wuya, Zhao Yu was probably the only one who had comprehended the law of space. Even among the deputy sect leaders, no one had comprehended the law of space. As soon as he finished speaking, Zhao Yu gently swung the long sword in his hand. He then looked at Wu Qinfeng and said indifferently, "All right, enough nonsense. It's time to send you on your way." After saying that, Zhao Yu took a step forward, and his figure instantly disappeared from the spot. Not even a trace of his aura was left behind. In an instant, they lost track of Zhao Yu. This was the law of space. It allowed one to become one with space for a short period of time and almost achieve the effect of invisibility. Completely unable to catch Zhao Yu's whereabouts, Wu Qinfeng's forehead and back were already covered with thick beads of sweat. He didn't know and couldn't be sure where Zhao Yu would suddenly attack from in the next second. Wu Qinfeng didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless, but he didn't have the slightest way to deal with it. As for escaping, he didn't even need to think about it. A cultivator who had comprehended the law of space was definitely at the top of his level in terms of speed. Wu Qinfeng simply didn't have the ability to get rid of Zhao Yu. Time passed slowly. In this kind of torment, Wu Qinfeng became more and more anxious. After all, waiting for death was the most difficult thing for a person. Just as Wu Qinfeng completely lost his patience, a sword appeared in front of Wu Qinfeng without any warning. It seemed to have appeared out of thin air. The person holding the sword couldn't be seen. Only a long sword could be seen piercing through Wu Qinfeng's heart at lightning speed. After Zhao Yu's sword successfully killed Wu Qinfeng, Zhao Yu's figure finally appeared in front of Wu Qinfeng. Looking at Zhao Yu in front of him, Wu Qinfeng muttered to himself, "Why? You? Why?" Wu Qinfeng was obviously a little unwilling. He and Zhao Yu were both at the Great Circle of Dao Realm, but in front of Zhao Yu, he couldn't even block a single sword strike and was easily killed by Zhao Yu. Wu Qinfeng didn't finish his words because he had no strength left. However, Zhao Yu still said indifferently, "Because I'm the sword head of the sword sect, and you're just an ant that can't even get on the stage. So even if our cultivation is the same, you're still not my match." After saying that, Zhao Yu sheathed his sword, and Wu Qinfeng died on the spot. After killing Wu Qinfeng, Zhao Yu cut off his head and returned to the Lingnan sect's temporary base. When Zhao Yu returned, the battle here was nearing its end. Most of the Sword Defiance Alliance's disciples had been killed, and only a few had managed to escape. Moreover, most of them were on unimportant missions. The sect leader, elders, and experts of the sword sect were not spared. The ground was littered with corpses, and blood had already gathered into a river. Not long after, the battle was completely over. Zhao Yu and the others immediately returned to Tong City to meet with Xiao Chun, Song Xing, and the others. In the back garden of Tong City's City Lord Mansion, Zhao Yu and the others saw Xiao Chun, Song Xing, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan. Zhao Yu respectfully saluted them. "Greetings, sect leader and vice sect leader. The Sword Defiance Alliance has been destroyed, and only a few people managed to escape." Hearing Zhao Yu's words, Xiao Chun smiled casually. "Thank you for your hard work. Sit." Hearing this, Zhao Yu and the others sat down. After that, Xiao Chun did not ask anything about the Sword Defiance Alliance. Even when he saw Wu Qinfeng's head, Xiao Chun only glanced at it indifferently. Obviously, in Xiao Chun's heart, the Sword Defiance Alliance was not worth mentioning, and there was no need for him to pay too much attention to it. Moreover, the result was within reason, so there was no need for him to pay too much attention to it. At this point, the matter seemed to have come to an end silently. The Sword Defiance Alliance, a laughable and lamentable alliance, had been completely destroyed before it had even been formally established. It did not even cause a ripple. Everyone sat together in a circle, and Xiao Chun slowly said, "The situation in the Sword Mansion must be stabilized as soon as possible. Song Xing and Nangong Guan will be fully responsible for the matters of the Martial Arts Academy. I hope that it can be carried out as soon as possible. You should know that we don't have much time to waste. The Heavenly Gate is our main target. Please add this to your collection, monthly votes, and recommendations." In a chapter, Chapter 2175. When Xiao Chan mentioned the heavenly sect, everyone present nodded in agreement. Indeed, to the Sword Sect, the so-called Reverse Sword Alliance was not worth mentioning at all. The real enemy of the Sword Sect was the Heavenly Sect, and the Sword Sect had no way to avoid the final battle with the Heavenly Sect. Although the Heavenly Sect and Yang Chun did not seem to have any special movements during this period of time, it would be a big mistake to think that this was the case. The Heavenly Sect and Yang Chun were definitely preparing for the final battle. Similarly, Xiao Chun and the Sword Sect were doing the same. Xiao Chun handed over the matter of the Martial Arts Academy to Tsang Xing and Nangongguan. Xiao Chun had also discussed the concept of the Martial Arts Academy with the two of them in detail. He believed that there would be no problem in handing it over to the two of them. The next day, Xiao Chun led the members of the Sword Sect out of Tong City and returned to the Sword Sect. As for Nangongguan and Tsang Xing, they stayed behind. After all, the two of them were going to set up the Martial Arts Academy system that Xiao Chun hoped for in the Sword Mansion. This would allow many ordinary people to have the opportunity to cultivate. Xiao Chun and his group returned to the Sword Sect safely. Half a month later, the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Sect regained their peace. Regardless of whether it was the Sword Sect or the Heavenly Sect, they did not take the initiative to find trouble with each other. It was rare for them to enjoy a trace of peace. However, the Great Thousand World could be said to be troubled times. Just as the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Sect had calmed down, another piece of news exploded like thunder and quickly spread throughout the Great Thousand World. En Litian, who had returned from the Wood World, appeared again. This time, En Litian and En Sheng appeared in the 10,000 weapon residents of the Equipment Sect and gradually formed a faction called the Heavenly En Tower. The high-profile appearance of Yu Li Tian naturally caused a strong reaction from the Heavenly Policy Hall. It could be said that the Heavenly Policy Hall viewed Yu Li Tian as their mortal enemy. It was similar to the relationship between the Sword Sect and the Heavenly Combined Gate. Previously, En Li Tianli had used the mountain river diagram to escape with En Sheng. Then he disappeared. The Heavenly Policy Mansion searched for him for a long time and spent a lot of effort, but they still couldn't find En Li Tianli. Now that Yu Li Tian had appeared in such a high-profile manner, and it seemed that he had the support of the Tool Sect, he had openly established the Heavenly En Tower in the Myriad Weapon Residence. In the Sword Sect, Xiao Chun also heard about En Li Tian. A strange look flashed through his eyes as he muttered softly, "Is it really just a coincidence that En Li Tian and his disciple appeared at this time?" The timing of the Lunar Day's appearance was too unusual, and Xiao Chun could sense a hint of danger from it. Upon hearing Xiao Chun's words, Zhou Song was a little puzzled and asked, "Junior brother, do you mean that En Li Tian is plotting something? I can't say for sure yet, but does senior brother know the current situation of the Great Thousand World?" Xiao Chun shook his head gently. When Xiao Chun asked Zhou Song about the current situation of the Great Thousand World, Zhou Song didn't respond for a moment. Upon seeing this, Xiao Chun said, as if he was talking to himself, "The Great Thousand World's ancestor emperors have gone to Tenzhou. In other words, there are no emperors in the Great Thousand World now." For En Li Tian to suddenly appear in such a high-profile manner at this time, there were no emperors in the Great Thousand World. The emperors, such as Jun Wuya, had gone to meet Tenzhou. The impact of En Li Tian's appearance at this time was self-evident. In the current Great Thousand World, no one could suppress En Li Tian, at least before the emperors returned. In other words, no one could stop En Li Tian from doing whatever he wanted during this period of time. Upon hearing Xiao Chen's words, Zhou Song's expression changed abruptly. He then asked in disbelief, "Junior brother, do you mean that En Li Tian wants to take advantage of this opportunity to take over the Great Thousand World?" "That won't happen. En Li Tian is not a fool. He knows that the Great Thousand World is not something he can take over. However, it's not impossible for him to take advantage of this opportunity to deal with the Heavenly Policy Hall," Xiao Chun said with a solemn expression. En Li Tian had every reason and motive to take action against the Heavenly Policy Hall. Moreover, This was the best opportunity. Without Li Xiao, no one in the Heavenly Policy Hall could resist Enlitian. Even if he couldn't completely destroy the Heavenly Policy Hall, he could at least deal a devastating blow to them. Thinking of this, Xiao Chun took out a voice transmission talisman and sent a message to Li Chun, telling him to be careful of Enlitian. Since Enlitian had appeared at this time, it was definitely not as simple as it seemed. Xiao Chun told Li Chun about his concerns. As for how Li Chun would react, he naturally couldn't control it. However, given Li Chun's character, he should understand his concerns. Xiao Chun didn't have a very close relationship with the Heavenly Policy Hall, but they could at least be considered friends. Therefore, between Enlitian and the Heavenly Policy Hall, Xiao Chun would definitely choose the Heavenly Policy Hall. Li Chun, who was in the Heavenly Policy Hall, received Xiao Chun's message immediately. He had been worried about Enlitian for the past few days. Now that he received Xiao Chun's message, Li Chun's mood became even heavier. Li Chun and an elder of the Heavenly Policy Hall sat opposite each other on the mountain peak in the cave dwelling. When he saw someone sending a message to Li Chun, the elder asked, "Hall Master, it's from the Sword Sect's Sect Master, Xiao Chun. He warned me to be careful of Enlitian. It is very likely that Enlitian will attack the Heavenly Policy Hall when the sovereigns are not around." Li Chun replied truthfully without hiding anything. Hearing Li Chun's words, the Heavenly Policy Hall's elders' expression became extremely solemn. They were also discussing the matter of Enlitian just now. The result of their speculation coincided with Xiao Chun's. Since even an outsider like Xiao Chun could see the danger that the Heavenly Policy Hall was in, the situation probably didn't allow the Heavenly Policy Hall to be lucky or be careless. A solemn look flashed across their eyes, after which Li Chun spoke in a somewhat low voice. "Pass down the order. Get everyone outside to return to the sect and activate the sect's great array. No one is allowed to take half a step out of the sect until Master returns." If they wanted to fight against Enlitian, they could only wait until Li Xiao returned from Tenzu. Before that, all Li Chun could do was to defend. However, although Li Chun had already sent a message to Li Xiao hadn't replied until now. Li Chun didn't know when Li Xiao would return and whether Enlitian would attack the Heavenly Policy Hall. The Heavenly Policy Hall entered a state of full alert. The sect's great formation was immediately activated. The many students and elders outside returned one after another, begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2176. Due to the high-profile appearance of Enlitian and his disciple, Li Chun immediately ordered the Heavenly Policy Mansion to enter a state of high alert. The protective array was also fully activated. Due to the high-profile appearance of Enlitian and his disciple, Li Chun immediately ordered the Heavenly Policy Mansion to enter a state of high alert. The protective array was also fully activated. However, to everyone's surprise, Enlitian and his disciple did not have any intention of making a move even after half a month had passed. It was as though they were not interested in the Heavenly Policy Mansion at all. However, there was one thing that was worth noting. The Heavenly Een Tower's influence in the 10,000 Weapon Mansion was getting bigger and bigger. In just half a month, they had already swallowed more than half of the forces in the 10,000 Weapon Mansion. Many experts had joined the Heavenly Een Tower. At the same time, many sects and clans in the 10,000 Weapon Mansion had also become the Heavenly Een Tower's subsidiary forces. However, there was no reaction in the face of the crazy expansion of the Heavenly Een Tower. It was as though they were letting it happen. Since they did not show up, there was no need for them to stop the Heavenly Een Tower. Logically speaking, as the overlord of the 10,000 Weapon Mansion, how could the equipment refining sect allow the Heavenly Een Tower to expand so brazenly in their own territory? In just half a month, the Heavenly Een Tower could almost compete with the equipment refining sect in the 10,000 Weapon Mansion with the tacit consent of the equipment refining sect. The situation in the 10,000 Weapon Mansion was very strange. The behavior of the equipment refining sect was even more puzzling. However, although all the major forces had placed their attention on the 10,000 weapon mansion, no one knew the real reason behind the abnormal behavior of the equipment refining sect. Meanwhile, in the weapon refining sect's headquarters in the 10,000 weapons mansion, a scene that no one could have imagined was playing out. In the main hall of the equipment refining sect, Litian, who was supposed to be the sect leader of the equipment refining sect, was sitting on the main seat. Below him, 7 or 8 vice-sect leaders of the equipment refining sect were standing respectfully. Litian's appearance in the equipment refining sect was already very strange. Moreover, the sect leader of the equipment refining sect seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. At the same time, at least half of the vice-sect leaders of the equipment refining sect had also mysteriously disappeared. Only 7 or 8 people were left in front of Litian. However, these 7 or 8 people were now standing respectfully in front of Litian. Litian looked at everyone present and said faintly, "Everyone has obeyed me. Naturally, I will not treat you unfairly. Everything will be the same as before," Litian said in an indifferent voice. Upon hearing this, the 7 to 8 weapon refining sect vice-sect masters respectfully bowed and replied, "The equipment refining sect leader of the equipment refining sect." Very soon, the spies of the Sword Gate and the other major factions had sent to the 1,000-weapon mansion continuously sent back new information. News that the sect leader of the armament sect had been missing for many days quickly reached the ears of Xiao Chun and the rest. After receiving this news, coupled with the recent abnormal behavior of the equipment refining sect and the Heavenly Yin Tower, Xiao Chun quickly guessed what had happened. Xiao Chun was sitting in the courtyard in the cave residence. He had just finished his training when he received the news. His eyes flashed with a strange look. Everyone is wrong. Litian and his disciples' target is not the Heavenly Policy Mansion, but the equipment refining sect. Xiao Chun quickly reacted. Litian and his disciples' appearance in the 10,000 weapon mansion had nothing to do with the equipment refining sect. Litian had probably already secretly taken control of the equipment refining sect before the two of them appeared. After all, there was no Emperor Realm Master in charge, and the equipment refining sect was defenseless. The equipment refining sect would not be able to stop Litian and his disciple. Moreover, with Litian's strength and the strange power of the mountain and river diagram, it would be easy for him to sneak into the equipment refining sect and kill the equipment refining sect leader. According to Xiao Chen's guess, Litian and his disciple had been hiding in the 10,000 weapon mansion after they disappeared, waiting for an opportunity. After the sovereigns left, Litian snuck into the tool refining sect with the help of the mountain and river diagram. He might have killed or imprisoned the sect master of the tool refining sect. Then he slowly took control of the entire tool refining sect and killed all those who did not obey him. According to Xiao Chen's guess, the equipment refining sect was now completely under Litian's control. As for the equipment refining sect leader, he was most likely dead. This was because Litian would never let the equipment refining sect leader live. Litian had come up with a plan long ago, and no one in the Great Thousand World had expected that he would target the equipment refining sect. The situation in the 10,000 weapon mansion was gradually becoming obvious, but the major sects in the Great Thousand World remained silent, which was rare. They had no choice. Now that the emperors were not in the Great Thousand World, no one wanted to offend Litian at this time. Of course, there was only one force, Dan Valley, that sent people to the 10,000 weapon mansion to investigate. The Dan Valley and the equipment refining sect had a good relationship, and the two sects had almost always maintained an alliance. After learning about the current situation in the equipment refining sect, as the new Valley Master of the Dan Valley, Dan Exine naturally could not sit back and do nothing. However, because Dan Xingyang was not in the Dan Valley, Dan Exine did not dare to take any drastic action. He could only send people to the 10,000 weapon mansion again to investigate. It would be best if he could find out what had happened in the equipment refining sect. In Dan Exine's cave residence in the Dan Valley, Dan Xian was in a bad mood these days. He had been angry about the equipment refining sect. At the same time, as more and more information came in, Dan Xian became more and more certain that the equipment refining sect must have undergone a great change. The entire equipment refining sect had most likely fallen into the hands of Letian and his disciple. With a gloomy face, Dan Xian scolded fiercely. Letian, you're courting death. Dan Xian was extremely irritated at the thought that his good friend might have met with a mishap. Facing the somewhat furious Dan Xian, a deputy valley master of the Dan Valley beside him also spoke in a low voice. Valley Master, now is not the time. Once there is a conflict with Letian, we will be the ones to suffer. Everything should wait for the ancestor to come back and discuss at length. Without Dan Xingyang, the Dan Valley obviously would not end well if they provoked Letian at this time. Dan Xian also knew this very well. Therefore, even though he was furious, Dan Xian still suppressed the anger in his heart and did not take the initiative to provoke Letian and his disciple. Instead, he waited for Dan Xingyang to return. However, Dan Xian also knew that even if Dan Xingyang returned, he would not be a match for Letian in terms of battle strength. After all, Dan Xingyang's battle strength was almost at the bottom among the sovereigns. Of course, the same was true for the equipment refining sect's ancestor. What's more, Letian now had the mountain and river diagram in his hand, which made him even more difficult to deal with. Please add this to your collection. Monthly vote, recommend. And a chapter. Chapter 2177. Naturally, Dan Xian had heard of the mountain and river diagram. Back then, the three emperors, Junhuia, Dao Xiong, and Li Xiao, wanted to join forces to kill Letian, but Letian managed to escape in the end. This proved that Letian, who possessed the mountain and river diagram, was not easy to deal with. Dan Xian sighed helplessly. At this moment, he felt a strong sense of powerlessness. Facing Letian and his disciple, Dan Xian did not know what to do. In addition, there were many things happening in the Great Thousand World. As the situation of the equipment refining sect became clearer, the other 10 great Ling Tian sects had not expressed their stance. Everyone had been watching coldly from the sidelines. The situation of the equipment refining sect became clearer. As time passed, the entire 10,000 weapon mansion was almost occupied by the Heavenly Yin Tower. Thinking about it, it was not difficult for the Heavenly Yin Tower to occupy the 10,000 weapon mansion, since they secretly controlled the equipment refining sect. After the 10,000 weapon mansion was completely occupied by the Heavenly Yin Tower, on this day, no one knew that Letian had secretly left the equipment refining sect and was rushing to the place where Tenzu was. As an emperor, Letian naturally knew where Tenzu was. In fact, he had set off this time to intercept and kill the old ancestor of the equipment refining sect. As long as he killed the old ancestor of the equipment refining sect, the equipment refining sect would be truly destroyed. At that time, the Heavenly Yin Tower could directly replace the equipment refining sect and become one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. This was Letian's real purpose. Letian secretly left the 10,000 weapon mansion and went to the route that the equipment refining sect's old ancestor must pass by to wait for the ambush. At the same time, in the endless starry sky outside the Great Thousand World, a small continent, like an isolated island floating on the sea, was floating alone in the dark starry sky. This was the residence of the Heavenly Ancestor. Apart from a time in the great wide world, the Heavenly Ancestor basically lived here. On this isolated island, there were many living beings created by the Heavenly Ancestor. Although they did not have cultivation, this isolated island looked extremely peaceful. There were small villages scattered all over the island, and the people here still adhered to the most primitive and natural living habits. They worked at sunrise and rested at sunset. The men plowed and the women weaved. Their days were peaceful and peaceful. Although these people might not know that there was a wider world and more exciting world outside of this isolated island, It was not difficult to see from these people's simple smiles that they felt very happy living here. At least, there were no disputes, wars, and they did not have to worry about being killed by others. And in the center of the island, beside a small lake, there was a simple, thatched hut. This was the residence of the heavenly ancestor. With a head full of silver hair and eyes full of kindness, he sat on the main seat. This was the will of the heavenly way, who was in charge of the great thousand world. At the same time, he was also the father of all the will of the heavenly way. He was known by the world as Tenzu. At first glance, he was a very kind and amiable old man. On both sides of the heavenly way seat were Jun Wuya and the other sovereigns who had rushed over from the great thousand world. Everyone sat together, drinking tea and drinking wine. The atmosphere was quite relaxed, and under such a relaxed atmosphere, they discussed many things. Time really flies. In the blink of an eye, you've all grown old, Tenzu said with a smile as he looked at the crowd. Tenzu did not wait for anyone to reply and change the topic. However, the change of era means that the great thousand world will be in chaos for a while. This is also a manifestation of the laws of heaven and earth, isn't it? Otherwise, if we old fellows are always in charge, how can the great thousand world make any progress? Jun Wia took a sip of wine and said with a chuckle, chaos was inevitable under the change of the old and new eras. This cannot be helped, but even so, the torrent of eras would still roll forward and would not stop because of this. After hearing Jun Wuya's words, the smile on Tenzu's face did not diminish. Yes, this is also a manifestation of the laws of heaven and earth. No one can stop it. Tenzu agreed with Jun Wuya's words very much, so he did not think of stopping anything from beginning to end. In fact, ever since Tenzu was born, he had almost never paid attention to the matters of the great thousand world. Unless there was a situation that concerned the survival of the great thousand world, or someone had threatened the existence of the great thousand world. Under such circumstances, Tenzu would directly intervene in the development of the situation. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, Tenzu would not casually intervene in the affairs of the great thousand world. Even if the major forces fought among themselves, Tenzu would not be willing to step in, let alone take sides. It was precisely because of this that the relationship between the heavenly ancestor and the emperors was so harmonious, and the emperors showed enough respect to the heavenly ancestor. This time, Tenzu did not gather the emperors for any special reason. It was mainly about the change of the old and new eras. However, outsiders naturally did not know what was said between them. The flow of time on the isolated island where Tenzu was located was completely different from the flow of time in the Great Thousand World. Therefore, the crowd had only stayed here for less than a day, but almost a year had passed in the Great Thousand World. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and when it was time to leave, the emperors got up and said goodbye one after another. However, before leaving, Tenzu suddenly called out to the tool refining sex old ancestor. Hearing Tenzu's voice, the tool refining sex old ancestor turned around and looked at Tenzu with some confusion. In this regard, Tenzu only said one sentence in the end. "Take care, old man." It seemed that Tenzu had said something that was somewhat confusing, but after hearing this, the tool refining sex old ancestor was stunned for a moment, then seemed to understand. In fact, your isolated island is not bad. If there's a chance, I would also like to live here. At least it's very quiet. After saying that, the tool refining sex old ancestor turned around and left. Looking at his back, Tenzu's expression was calm, but there was a flash of emotion in his eyes. He did not know if the tool refining sex old ancestor could return to the tool refining sex safely this time. But in Tenzu's opinion, it would be very difficult, because there were already people waiting for him halfway. After leaving Tenzu's place, the emperors returned to the Great Thousand World one after another. On the way back, as soon as the tool refining sex old ancestor entered the Great Thousand World, the figure of Letian slowly appeared in front of him. Seeing Letian, the tool refining sex old ancestor was taken aback for a moment. Then he laughed self-deprecatingly. "Letian, you made a special trip here. Don't tell me you're here to chat with this old man. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2178. The Tulsek's old ancestor and Enli Tian were naturally acquainted with each other, as they had met many years ago. Hearing the Tulsek's old ancestor's words, Enli Tian smiled noncommittally. Of course not. I have a request. The Tulsek's old ancestor and Enli Tian were naturally acquainted with each other, as they had met many years ago. Hearing the Tulsek's old ancestor's words, Enli Tian smiled noncommittally. Of course not. I have a request. Enli Tian claimed that he had a request. Hearing this, the Tulsek's old ancestor sneered. You have a request? Naturally, I would like to borrow your life. Enli Tian also sneered upon hearing those words. Enli Tian's murderous intent was no longer held back. Sensing Enli Tian's murderous intent, the Tulsek's old ancestor did not show the slightest fear. After all, as an emperor and having lived for so many years, the Tulsek's old ancestor had long been able to conceal his emotions. He looked calmly at Enli Tian. Enli Tian did not speak any more nonsense. He took a step forward and his figure instantly disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already in front of the Tulsek's old ancestor. He threw a punch directly at the Tulsek's old ancestor. The purpose of Enli Tian's appearance here was to kill the Tulsek's old ancestor, so there was nothing much to say when the two met. At the same time, facing Enli Tian's attack, the Tulsek's old ancestor did not hesitate and directly counterattacked. In the empty wasteland, the two emperors fought fiercely. In the blink of an eye, they had exchanged hundreds of blows. In the beginning, the two could be said to be evenly matched. After all, they were both emperors, so it was not an easy task for either of them to defeat the other. However, as time passed, after more than half a day of fierce fighting, the Tulsek's old ancestor slowly showed a trace of fatigue. Like Danqing Yang, the Tulsek's old ancestor was not an emperor who relied on his battle prowess. Therefore, in terms of pure battle prowess, the Tulsek's old ancestor did not have any advantage. Perhaps this was the reason why Enli Tian targeted the Tulsek's old ancestor. After all, it was very difficult for Enli Tian to kill sovereigns like Jun Wuya and Li Shao, but it was much easier to kill sovereigns like the Tulsek's old ancestor and Danqing Yang, who were not known for their combat strength. After gradually gaining the upper hand, Enli Tian's attacks became more and more ferocious, and it seemed like he wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. In the face of Enli Tian's ferocious attacks, the old ancestor of the equipment refining sect seemed to have predicted his own outcome. However, at his age, he had already become indifferent to Siyu's life and death. The only thing that the old ancestor of the equipment refining sect could not let go of was the entire equipment refining sect. Chapter 2181. Facing four emperors at the same time, Enli Tian was not nervous at all. On the contrary, he appeared very relaxed, as if Li Shao, Jun Wuya, Luo Xing, and Danqing Yang were not a threat to him at all. Hearing Enli Tian's words, the coldness in Li Zhao's eyes intensified, and he shouted coldly, Enli Tian, stop trying to be mysterious. Today, I will kill you. Trying to be mysterious, huh? So, junior brother, even after so many years, you still haven't changed at all. Enli Tian sneered coldly upon hearing those words. As Enli Tian's voice fell, 3 spatial cracks tore open behind him. Then, Tao Ming, Yun Shun, and the old ancestor of the shrines slowly walked out from them. Another 3 emperors had arrived. Seeing the 3 of them, Li Xiao's face became even more unsightly. If Li Xiao still did not know where Yin Li Tian's confidence came from, then he would have lived for so many years in vain. It was no wonder that Yin Li Tian was not nervous when facing Li Xiao and the other 3. It turned out that he already had helpers. However, the fact that Tao Ming, Yun Shun, and Yun Shan would lend a helping hand to Yin Li Tian was somewhat unexpected. After all, Tao Ming and Yun Shan were the youngest sovereigns among the current sovereigns, and there was no interaction between them and Yin Li Tian. As for the old ancestor of the shrines, although he might have known Yin Li Tian before, he would not help him. Yin Li Tian said that there was a hierarchy because he had already made an agreement with Tao Ming and the other 3. Therefore, he was not afraid of Li Xiao, Jun Wuya, and the other 3's attack. After establishing the Heavenly Yin Tower, Yin Li Tian naturally had to plan thoroughly if he wanted the Heavenly Yin Tower to secure its former position as the equipment refining sect. After all, he knew Li Xiao's character very well. Li Xiao wouldn't give him any chances. With the appearance of Tao Ming, Yun Shun, and the old ancestor of the shrines, Li Xiao was stunned for a moment. Then, he looked at the 3 and asked coldly, "Are you going to help this traitor?" Hearing Li Xiao's words, Tao Ming smiled and said, "Brother Yin and I hit it off, so it's natural for us to help each other. The structure of the Great Thousand Realms is no longer the same as before. The hatred from before should have dissipated." The great ancestor of the shrines added. Tao Ming and the old ancestor of the shrines spoke one after another. As for Yun Shun, he remained silent, but his actions spoke volumes. With the appearance of Tao Ming and Yun Shun, the situation became 4 against 4. 8 emperors gathered above the Heavenly Yin Tower, facing each other. It was no wonder why Yin Li Tian had not shown any fear earlier. It turned out that he had Tao Ming's group of 3 backing him up. Naturally, Yin Li Tian had nothing to worry about in a 4-on-4 situation.